Hey everyone. Welcome back for the fourth and final part of the cost of living. As always, huge thanks to all of my Patreons. Making these videos would be impossible without you guys' support, especially with all the restrictions YouTube places on my type of content. After this video, feel free to head over there, where you can find about 30 other different stories to enjoy. Also, feel free to send me any messages over there if you have any questions or even if you just want to chat. Link to all of that will be in the description. Anyways, everyone, enjoy the video. Chapter 18, Competition. Pride, in all its forms, was a terrible thing. It made people take risks they wouldn't normally take just to prove a point, spurred them to do things differently from their routine simply for the sake of it. Arrogance, and the distinct lack of ability to control his temper, though that was quite beside the point, had gotten Kakuzu killed by the hands of those he looked down upon. The problem was that pride was generally something that was earned. At least, it was in Kakuzu's case. After all, surviving in the ninja world for almost a century tended to make a shinobi confident in his abilities. If nothing else, the old bounty hunter had proven time and again that he was certainly capable enough with his skills to back up his arrogance. Naruto had never really gotten the opportunity to defend his pride, especially since his time with Kakuzu had been cut short due to the former Taki Nin Zakatsuki-related responsibilities. Which was why the blonde was crouched on a tree bough, on a cliff of the peninsula that was the land of birds, looking out over the ocean in the direction of the land of water. I would like to see you penetrate Kirigakure's defenses with your measly skills. Considering how difficult it is to get into the country, remain inconspicuous, find and capture the target, and get out without raising suspicion, 2 months is hardly a long time. I expect you will take at least 6 your first time. Granted, Naruto had been 11 when Kakuzu had said that, but he figured that age hardly made a difference in the Nukenin's eyes. He was going to prove to his wayward teacher that he could surpass the man's expectations for him, all by doing something that was, arguably, incredibly foolish. It was a little sad that most of his motivation was still derived from trying to get Kakuzu to acknowledge him, especially when the old Nukenin was unlikely to do so, but Naruto strove to accomplish the impossible. In a lot of ways, he was like a kid trying to earn the attention of his parent by whatever means necessary. Pride really was a terrible thing. Still, the blonde felt that he was ready for such a venture. He thought that he was strong enough to take on the majority of the denizens within the Hidden Mist one-on-one. Notable exceptions would include the Mizukage and any remaining members of the 7 shinobi swordsmen, and had even prepared for the journey accordingly. Gone were the traveler's cloak and pants he'd been wearing for the past several months. Now he was dressed in blue pants and a sleeveless, backless gray top, over which was a loose, blue-gray, to better blend into the mist, long-sleeved shirt. It was open in the front, with the left sleeve only going down to his elbow. Bandages wound around his left arm from bicep to wrist, and his feet were clad in black shinobi sandals. The slashed Konoha Hideate was displayed at a slight angle on his forehead, restraining his wild, blonde spikes. Overall, Naruto thought he looked badass. The knowledge that Kakuzu would surely criticize him for his strange choice in garb was completely irrelevant. He flipped through the bingo book the older thread user had bestowed upon him, going to the section relegated for shinobi of the Hidden Mist. His fingers stopped at the page depicting the shinobi he had chosen as his target. Given how outdated Kakuzu's tome was, and why the blonde hadn't gotten a new one, he couldn't explain. Some modicum of sentiment or symbolism, probably. The boy Naruto was staring at was probably a couple years older than his current age. In the picture, he looked to be perhaps 12 or 13, with shoulder-length brown hair fashioned in such a way that only the golden iris of his right eye was visible. The boy was pale-skinned and wore a laconic expression, but to have achieved the status of Jonin at such a young age implied that he was likely some sort of prodigy. And Naruto enjoyed a challenge. Plus, the Kiri-nin was labeled as a bubble user, which the blonde had never heard of before. He wasn't all that interested in stealing his target's heart. He was still in the process of perfecting how to use Storm Release, though he could at least use it, but the prospect of facing an unknown jutsu was interesting. Killing the strange boy, adult, he reminded himself, taking into account the age difference between them and his recently past 17th birthday, would give him plenty of bragging rights when he eventually ran into Kakuzu again. The 50 million Ryo bounty he would collect didn't hurt either. Naruto leapt from the tree to the ground and approached the edge of the cliff. He groaned as he began to push threads from his back, carefully so as to not shred his shirt. Soon enough, a massive pair of black wings was situated between his shoulder blades. "Look out, Utakata," he warned, sealing the bingo book into a small scroll before storing it in his arm. "I'm coming for you." He dove off the cliff, and moments later, Jeong carried him high into the sky, where he was lost to the mist. LLL. Naruto stepped on the smoldering remnants of his fire and let out a noise somewhere between a sigh and a growl. He had spent the last month camped out on one of the many islands surrounding the main island which housed Kirigakure, slowly exploring the territory that comprised the land of water, and the dreariness and repetition of the place was starting to grate on his nerves. If this was what it was like to be on a stakeout for a specific target, Naruto could easily understand why Kakuzu had such a hair-thin temper. It had only been 4 weeks, and his patience was already gone. Decades of having gone through the same motions had probably diminished the Nukenin's ability to tolerate annoyances to nothing. It was a little disheartening to discover that he was actually starting to empathize with his wayward teacher, but the young thread user tried not to dwell on that realization. "Well, time to get going, again," the blonde muttered. He walked down to the shore and carefully stepped out onto the water, making his way toward the Hidden Mist village. Although he wasn't a big fan of the reconnaissance required to successfully infiltrate Kirigakure, Naruto was forced to admit that being cautious had definitely prevented him from stepping into a situation that he wasn't prepared for. Taking on a handful of Jonin-level shinobi he could handle. Facing down scores of Jonin and Oinin, the Mist's equivalent of Onbu? Well, that was a little less likely to have favorable results. That was the situation he would have been forced to face had he tried to just fly into Kirigakure with Jeong. The truth was that the Hidden Mist was surprisingly well defended. Even given the haze which seemed a permanent fixture of the country's climate, or perhaps in spite of it, sentry towers littered the ridge of the main island, making approaching it by any means a difficult venture. Given how isolated the entirety of the land of water was, Naruto wondered if such precautions were even necessary. Then again, when a country had as many Nukenin as Kirigakure seemed to have, perhaps such paranoia was completely justified. Regardless, approaching from anything other than the water was impossible. Even doing that had proven to be an extremely risky challenge comprised of water walking atop the ocean. Finding some way to get up the cliff face, Naruto had opted to actually use an earth jutsu to just go through the rock, and then melding into the bustle of the village itself. It had taken a week of surveillance to come up with that strategy, after choosing the island closest to the main one to take up temporary residence. Of course, so far, getting into Kirigakure had been the easy part. Since the natives of the Land of Water were relatively isolated people, Naruto hadn't wanted to play the tourist card to dig for information on his target, especially since a civilian would have no need to know. The Mizukage was clearly a very imposing figure if she could keep such a tight grip on the flow of information in her village. Once eavesdropping had failed to produce anything useful, Naruto had opted into the remaining 2 methods. It hadn't taken too long to find out the location of the Mist's bubble users, though physically finding the building and investigating it had taken a bit longer than the blonde had preferred it would. Disappointingly, Utakata had not been there. In the hope that he could find some clue as to his target's whereabouts, Naruto had spent several consecutive nights infiltrating the mission archives for a hint as to where the man might be. One night, he had finally gotten lucky and found a mission with Utakata's name listed on it. Unfortunately, he had quickly discovered that the bubble user was the mission. Utakata was a Nukenin, and had been for a long time. One of the tiny islands far away from Kirigakure had borne his, admittedly childish, temper tantrum. Naruto honestly wasn't sure if he was angrier at Kakuzu for having such an out-of-date bingo book or at himself for still using the damn thing. Granted, it wasn't the older man's fault that he had clung onto the tome with such lingering attachment, and his teacher had at least kept it updated with giant slashes across the pages of his victims, but he still felt rather miffed at the waste of his time. That thought had given him pause. Utakata was likely still alive somewhere. He had to have a search team sent out relatively recently. If that was the case, he was still an available target, one with a 50 million Ryo bounty on his head. Naruto had decided he would rather see his original mission through to the end. Kakuzu would likely never let go of the fact that his pupil had abandoned his target when times got tough, if he found out, then choose a new target from the citizens of the Hidden Mist. Kirigakure wasn't going anywhere. He could always return at a different point in time and kill someone, especially now that he knew the method to get in. The problem was that Utakata could be anywhere. Starting the search from scratch had been an unappealing idea, so Naruto had taken to hiding in the headquarters of the Oinin, which had taken a full 2 days to find, with the hiding and camouflage technique and listening for any promising information. He was going on 5 days of no leads, and the lack of any real action was starting to make the threads within his body twitch agitatedly. "Yeah, I get it," he griped mentally, crouched beneath an empty desk. "Not like this is a party for me, either. But it makes more sense to find some clue as to his whereabouts here, where they're actively searching for him, than roaming the world and hoping to run into him." Naruto was practically asleep when a man with long, black hair and a scar trailing down over his left eye entered the headquarters, a scroll in hand. 4 shinobi dropped what they were doing and approached him. The previous team assigned to capture Utakata has been found. Translation: they're dead, Naruto thought with morbid amusement. Their bodies were discovered near Tsushigumo village, continued the dark-haired male. We will start our search from there. He affixed the porcelain mask of the Mist's Oinen to his face. Move out. Naruto mock saluted the man as the squad left. Sure thing, boss. Thanks for the info. He snuck out behind the group of Hunter Nin and never looked back. LLL. Deciding that stowing aboard whatever vessel the Kiri Nin would use to make it to the mainland was a bit dangerous, Naruto returned to his island as quickly as possible to find a launching point to fly overhead. Even though he now had information on his target, the blonde figured it was easier to let the Hunter Nin find Utakata and then swoop in and steal the kill rather than exert the energy wandering aimlessly himself. Besides, the Mist Shinobi would have a better idea of Utakata's habits and idiosyncrasies than he did, meaning the tracking part of the retrieval mission would go much more smoothly than if he tried it himself. It might take some time, but at least he was doing something now. Compared to how long he thought it might take, the Kiri Nin led him to Tsushigumo village, located in the eastern portion of the Land of Fire, within a handful of days. Apparently they were as eager to find the missing bubble user as Naruto was, making berth at a port in the Land of Birds and keeping a rigorous pace across the mainland. The villagers didn't have much to offer as far as intelligence went when the Kiri Nin questioned them, though one mentioned a rumor that some young shinobi had taken up residence at Mount Katsuragi, the home of the former Tsushigumo clan leader. When the Oinen inquired further as to the location, the villager pointed into the distance, where a tall, rocky structure loomed over the forest. Naruto opted to follow the lead of the Mist Shinobi that evening and settled in for a good night's rest, though far away from their camp. Remaining constantly cloaked under the hiding and camouflage technique in order to evade detection wasn't draining on his chakra, but the unwavering concentration it required to remain active was giving him a headache. To be fully prepared for the upcoming fights against the squad from Mist, which he would have to neutralize, and Utakata, he wanted to be in tip-top shape. With that thought in mind, he summoned a chameleon to watch over him, as a precaution, and then settled down to sleep. He awoke the next morning to the chameleon's alert that the Kiri Nin were on the move. Thanking the reptile, Naruto took off in the direction of Mount Katsuragi. By the time noon rolled around, he'd reached the edge of the forest which opened to the mountain. The team from Mist was already approaching the sheer rock, either avoiding or deactivating the seals and traps meant to protect Mount Katsuragi from invaders. Cloaked in Meisai Gakur no Jutsu, Naruto followed them, unsure if the traps were triggered by movement, chakra, or some other mechanism, and unwilling to become a test subject so close to his goal. It only took a number of minutes to navigate the maze of triggered traps, and by the time the blonde reached the Mist Shinobi, they were standing before the cliff face, staring at a man in a blue kimono. Naruto compared the features of the man, dark brown, shoulder-length hair and gold-colored eyes, to what he remembered from the bingo book. His eyes focused on the pale gold pipe tucked into a band mostly hidden by the kimono, right next to a cylindrical green jug. That looks like it could blow bubbles. The leader of the Kiri Nin stepped forward. Utakata. Score. You will return with us to Kirigakure. Surrender yourself, or we will be forced to detain you. And, I think that's my cue. Naruto stepped between Utakata and the squad of Hunter Nin, his back to the brunette Nukenin. Wordlessly, he dropped the hiding and camouflage technique, taking small delight in the way the shinobi before him started at his appearance. Gentlemen, he announced, thank you for your assistance. It would have taken me forever to track this guy down, he added, thumbing behind him to Utakata. Konoha Nukenin, he heard one ninja whisper to another. We have no quarrel with you, the leader informed him. Step aside and let us do our duty. That was enough to galvanize Utakata into action, for he immediately leapt to the side and made for the safety of the forest. Stop him, commanded the lead Hunter Nin. The shinobi closest to the Nukenin formed a whip of water and sent it towards the brunette, but Naruto jumped over them and released a blade of wind that sliced through the weapon, causing it to lose its cohesiveness. He tutted, you'll have to get past me if you want to get to him. He bit his thumb and formed seals, slamming his palm on the ground. Kamikoso appeared, now double the size he had been when the blonde had summoned him to kill Kidomaru's giant spider. Naruto jerked his head behind him. Follow him. The chameleon immediately became invisible, only a burst of wind announcing his departure. All the Kiri Nin before him tensed. You'll regret doing that, child. Naruto bristled a little at the insult, he was a teenager, damn it. But said nothing. Konoha Nin, always so cocky. You never should have revealed yourself. Well, you're partially right, Naruto allowed. I am quite cocky. While taking victims by surprise vis-a-vis being invisible was strategically smarter, there was far less satisfaction in witnessing them realize they were outclassed, especially when they were as arrogant as this bunch seemed to be. Idly, the blonde wondered if having such a mindset was hypocritical, given what he was doing. On top of that, he didn't want to have to fight Utakata in a location the other male was familiar with. If he had killed all the Kiri Nin before revealing himself, it was far more likely that he would have gotten into conflict with the brunette at the base of the mountain, where there might still be traps, and support from any inhabitants from above. Making himself visible had given the older male an opportunity to escape to the forest, where Naruto would have an advantage, while he handled the hunter Nin. Water whips lanced out at him from 3 of the shinobi. Naruto allowed them to wind around his body, surreptitiously extruding his lightning heart from his back, keeping it hidden under his shirt. Big mistake, he warned, and the threads rose over his head, blue electricity crackling in the mouth of the mask. It danced down the liquid weapons and zapped the trio of Kiri Nin holding them, overloading their neural functions and dropping them like stones. The 4th subordinate sent a wave of electricity at him, which was dispersed by a blast of air. Naruto inhaled and spat out a futon, Shinkagyoku. The wind bullets punched through the ninja's body, killing him before he hit the ground. You were saying? Though the mask hid the leader's facial expression, Naruto imagined that the man was scowling at him. Those were good men you killed. They will not have died in vain. Haijutsu, Kirisame. Mist shrouded the immediate area, accompanied by a slight drizzle. Naruto watched as the Kiri Nin's form wavered and faded into the haze. A little rain isn't gonna stop me, he informed his surroundings. The blonde summoned wind chakra to his arms, but the fog and rain ate at the chakra until there was nothing left. Cute trick, he admitted, but it won't be enough. Water suddenly coalesced around him, forming a sphere that halted his movements. The hunter Nin became visible, one hand holding up the water prison technique. You're immobilized and incapable of using ninjutsu, and overconfident. That was your downfall. Without warning, black threads burst forth from underneath Naruto's bandaged arm, spearing through the orb of liquid and into the mist shinobi. It was a testament to the blonde's control over the kinjutsu and practice that the tendrils didn't shred either his clothing or wrappings. The man gagged at the invasive feeling of threads in his body, his construct collapsing and allowing the Jinchuriki to approach him. Once again, you're only partially right. With a simple mental command, Jeong constricted, crushing the man's heart in an instant. Well, he mused as the mist surrounding him dissipated, that was far easier than I expected it to be. I guess I'm getting better at this. He turned to face the direction Utakata had disappeared in. Now it's time to get the main prize. The blonde bounded in the direction of the forest, putting a little extra pep in his step in order to make up the time lost killing the hunter Nin. Kamikoso, though invisible, had made sure to leave his summoner a rather clear trail to follow, as broken branches and bark burned by acid littered the path ahead. As the minutes passed, Naruto noticed that the amount of markings for him to follow was decreasing. I hope that's a sign that I'm catching up. His musing was answered when the blue-robed male's figure became visible in the forest just ahead. Utakata's breathing appeared labored, and there looked to be a small spot of red on the white bandages wrapped around his chest. Kamikoso was nowhere to be found, and the blonde deduced that he had returned to the Bankaku forest after Utakata had stopped moving. Hello there. Naruto called out, a bit too cheerfully considering what he was there to do. You don't look so good. Utakata glared at him. What do you want from me? The bounty on your head, the blonde responded easily. I already took care of the oinen that were on your tail, we had conflicting interests. He cocked his head to the side. You know, in a way, you should be grateful to me, who knows what those guys would have done to you once you were back in Kirigakure. The brunette remained silent. Naruto took a step forward. So, are we gonna do this the easy way, or the hard way? Personally, I was hoping you'd put up a little bit of a challenge, but considering your condition. Neither, Utakata returned. Naruto suddenly became aware of the amount of bubbles surrounding him. I'm done with you, he snapped his fingers. Suten, Homatsu no Jutsu. The entire array of watery spheres exploded. Naruto barely managed to activate the Earth Spear technique as a fail-safe defensive maneuver, and even then, he was blown back several yards by the concussive blast. He jumped onto a thick branch of a nearby tree. So, this is the type of stuff you can pull off with Shibandama Ninjutsu, huh? Interesting. Utakata didn't bother responding, instead jerking his head and expelling an arc of water that soared for Naruto's neck. Suten, Maizu Kiri no Jutsu. You're not much for banter, are you? Naruto muttered. He tried jumping away from his perch, but found his foot stuck to the branch by dark green slime. When did he? His eyes focused back on the incoming water cutter. Questions later, protect from decapitation now. The blonde crossed his arms before his neck protectively and once more hardened his skin. Water broke over the impenetrable defense of the earth spear technique, the elemental advantage of Naruto's jutsu serving to further block the liquid. When he lowered his arms, a wave of greenish-tinged water was already on its way to crash over him. Not liking how different it looked from normal Suiton attacks, the blonde undid his sandal and slipped out of it, retreating to the ground as the wave washed over the tree. The plant vanished with a sickening hiss, melting down to the earth and leaving a small divot where it once stood. Naruto frowned. Acid, he can mix a powerful acid into his ninjutsu. Plus, he can cause explosions with his bubbles and create some sort of sticky substance that's difficult to escape from, and that I likely won't be able to get away from again, he thought, sparing a mournful glance to his bare foot. He undid the other sandal and pulled it off, tossing it away into the bushes. And he's smart. Man, do I know how to pick him or what? Another field of bubbles floated into his vision. He spared a quick glance at Utakata and found that the older male hadn't moved from his original position. Fine, let's take the battle to you then. The Jinchuriki leapt into the air and corkscrewed, using chakra to manipulate the surrounding air. This time, when the bubbles exploded, Naruto was safely ensconced in his Kazekyu, a protective sphere of wind that was partially inspired by Hyuga Neiji's Kaiden. Descending from his jump, he performed hand signs and then threw his palms forward with a shout. A powerful great breakthrough ripped through the woods, blowing away any of Utakata's attempts at a follow-up assault. As the winds from his jutsu blew past, Naruto raced forward and engaged in a taijutsu battle with Utakata. The former mist shinobi was no slouch, even injured, using his surprisingly durable bubble blower to block several hits. Fed up with the weapon which seemed to cause him so much trouble, the blonde commanded several threads to pop out of the suture near his wrist. He had a moment to revel in the bubble user's look of surprise as his kinjutsu twined around the bubble blower and yanked it from the male's grasp. With the instrument in his possession, the Jinchuriki hardened his fist and crushed it. Instead of the sound of crunching bamboo, there was a slight pop. Naruto's eyes widened slightly as Utakata became suddenly transparent and then promptly exploded. The force of the blast sent him flying backwards out of the ensuing smoke cloud. He was mostly unharmed, though his clothes were severely rumpled and the bandages wound around his left arm were smudged with dirt and unraveling. Naruto was suddenly grateful for how resilient Jung made his body. Small cuts were normally stitched close within seconds, and his possession of the kinjutsu had altered his body structure so that bleeding was a relatively rare occurrence. Blue eyes roved around the area warily. "You're good," he commented, loud enough for his target to hear him from wherever he was. "Using a bubble clone to flesh out what I could do while also going for the kill. Gotta admit that this is more of a challenge than I thought it would be." When it became apparent that Utakata wasn't going to attack him, Naruto slowly began to form hand seals. If the bubble user wasn't going to show himself, and honestly, that was probably the smartest strategy, then Naruto would just have to flush him out. He had finally started to take Kakuzu's words about creating his own ultimate techniques to heart, and had opted to begin with the element his body was best attuned to, wind. Despite the fact that he could use the technique through Jeong, he preferred to keep his wind heart safely secured inside his body so as to use a wider range of techniques, not to mention that Utakata's apparent tendency toward explosions meant that, on their own, his thread creatures might not survive alone in battle. The threads were hardy, but only to a certain point. That was okay, though. He wanted to see what his wind jutsu could do by his own power. Inhaling deeply, he paused for a moment to collect the required chakra and finish the last seal. Futon, Kusaku Kokiden. A large sphere of wind burst forth from his mouth, approximately the size of his head. It tore through the forest directly in front of the blonde, digging a shallow trench in the earth as it moved. Naruto watched with some pride as any trees in the drilling air bullet's way were uprooted and turned into splinters. The theory of the technique was actually quite simple. The sphere of air was made entirely of slicing wind chakra, which gave it the cutting quality necessary to tear a long path in anything in its way. After a short swath of destruction was carved, the drilling air bullet would release its shape, sending a veritable wall of cutting air out in a wide area. In a lot of ways, it was similar to Kakuzu's own ultimate wind technique. It was difficult to not do so, given that, with little exception, many ninjutsu had the same effect, but the initial, compact size of the attack made the follow-up explosion of air unexpected. "I'm gonna hope that hit him," thought the blonde, though my luck so far would indicate that to be unlikely. He was proven right when another flurry of bubbles came at him from his left. Naruto erected an earthen wall for them to pop against harmlessly before placing both palms against the hardened soil and pushing, sending it in the direction of the assault. It slammed into the nearest tree, which creaked and toppled backwards. Utakata jumped to the ground, bubble blower held at the ready. There was a tense moment as both combatants stared at each other, waiting for the other to make a move. The whistling of wind caused both shinobi to turn in the direction Naruto had launched the Kusaku Kokiden. A gale-force tempest swept through the area, picking up the pair and throwing them into a tumble with a pile of broken bark and branches. Naruto groaned and rubbed his head as he picked himself out of the debris of wood. NNGH, damn, I already took out the Kiri Nin. There shouldn't be any Konoha Nin this far out in the land of fire right now, who the hell else would interfere with my business? Hey, check it out. It's the little blonde shitstain. Naruto felt his eye begin to spasmodically twitch. No fucking way. He looked up and saw the telltale black cloak with red clouds of Akatsuki. Astute as usual, Hidan, came the dry retort. Kakuzu's strange green eyes focused intently on Naruto. Hello, brat. LLL. Kakuzu would admit to being surprised at running into his blonde pupil. The world was vast, and the likelihood of actually encountering his legacy considering their current assignments was small to be sure. The sheer irony that they were both chasing the same target was a huge coincidence, though massively amusing. Judging by the expression on the younger thread user's face, Naruto did not share such sentiment. What the hell are you doing here? Kakuzu smirked behind his mask, distinctly aware that he should feel insulted, yet more entertained by his student's ire. Hunting. Naruto's blue eyes shifted briefly to the pile of tree debris that Utakata was, presumably, buried under before returning to stare at his teacher. No you don't. That bastard is mine, he declared, pointing in the former Kiri Nin's direction. And how did you even find this guy, anyway? The former Taki Nin remained unaffected by Naruto's anger. Truthfully, Pain had contacted him a number of days ago with some information about the Rakubi while he and Hidan had, again, been venturing across the land of frost. Apparently, one of Sasori's spies in the Hidden Mist, and Kakuzu privately marveled at how expansive and well-developed the puppeteer spy network was, had filed a mission which detailed the departure of a squad of Onin to the Tsushigumo village, where a previous team of hunters had disappeared. Based on that, he and Hidan had immediately headed for the Land of Fire to ascertain the veracity of the claim. Of course, the bounty hunter had no intention of letting his protege know any of that. Talent, something which you apparently still lack. Naruto's lip curled a little at the insult. I swear. He started, lifting his finger towards his mentor, I will fight you over this, Kakuzu. I already owe you one for putting me in the bingo book, this guy's mine. Hey, I'd like to see you try, Blondie, Hidan interjected, removing his scythe from his back. Your attempt at fighting us would be quite amusing, Kakuzu agreed, skating over his pupil's accusation, but I would prefer to save my energy for an actual challenge. He tilted his head to one side curiously. I am mildly surprised to see you looking as well as you do. Why? Naruto asked, suspicious. This guy's pretty skilled, but he's nothing I can't handle. Kakuzu, for once, chose to ignore the setup Naruto had, unknowingly, given him. You have no idea who he is, do you? The blonde arched one eyebrow. Utakata, bubbler user of Kirigakure, worth 50 million ryo. There was a loud roar, followed by a wave of foul chakra and then the hissing of something disintegrating. Naruto looked over to where Utakata was supposed to be buried to find a vaguely humanoid form covered in red-black skin, 6 oblong tails protruding from the base of its spine. He is the Jinchuriki of the Rakubi, Kakuzu intoned, and it appears that he can excrete a sort of acidic substance which burns anything which it comes into contact with. Interesting. He took a step towards the transformed Jinchuriki, but Naruto's protesting shout caused him to stop. Hey, I told you that he's mine. Jinchuriki or not, I found him first, and I'm the one who's gonna get the money. Kakuzu spared him a dry look. Part of the danger, and aggravation, Naruto posed was that he was nothing more than a child in an adult/adolescent's body. Take away his toys, tell him not to do something, let an idea that he couldn't do something, take vengeance upon Konoha, for instance, fester long enough, and he would do anything to prove the naysayer wrong. Do not challenge me, brat. Find a target more suitable to your skill level, a Kusugake or Chunin, for instance. Naruto growled and charged the man, tired of his teacher's insults. Simultaneously, a stream of bubbles exited Utakata's gaping maw. The bounty hunter blocked his pupil's first strike and punched him in the solar plexus with the other hand. He grabbed the blonde by the neck and spun, launching him into the air above Utakata. As the transformed Jinchuriki looked up, Kakuzu went through hand seals, causing his wind heart to appear on his shoulder and launch a futon, Atsugai in the boy's direction. The approaching bubbles popped instantly, sliced by the sharpest element, and Utakata slid back a number of feet. Naruto, airborne, was picked up by the gale force winds and hurled far into the surrounding trees. Kakuzu watched expressionlessly as his student fell away. "Stay back, Hidan," he warned. "The rights to this Jinchuriki belong to me." LLL. Naruto returned to alertness after several minutes, distinctly aware of how uncomfortable he was. Kakuzu had pressed some sort of nerve in his neck which had caused him to temporarily black out, and his body had landed in a tree, limbs splayed awkwardly across several different branches. "I hate him," he muttered, knowing it wasn't true but feeling vindicated regardless. No matter what Kakuzu did, Naruto would always find himself in the man's debt for rescuing him and helping him to grow. Each put up with the crap the other dished out, it was just how they operated. The blonde just happened to be on the receiving end more than his teacher. None of that prevented him from being pissed at his mentor for taking over his fight, but that was quite beside the point. In the distance, Naruto saw a bluish-white, rounded head crest the treetops. He squinted at the figure. "Is that the Rakubi? Way to go, Kakuzu," he thought sarcastically, rolling his eyes. It only took a moment to right himself and descend to the ground. "Alright, here's what's gonna happen. I'm gonna let Kakuzu wear him down, and then, when he least expects it, I'll swoop in and steal his thunder, just like he did to me. Yeah, victory and vengeance, I can't wait to, hey." Wood sprouted from the earth and boxed in the blonde, trapping him in a solid cube with no slits or air holes. "Of course," he sighed, voice resounding in the enclosed space, "the party wouldn't be complete without you, Tenzo." "Greetings, Jinchuriki," he heard the man say. "How'd you find me?" "I felt a Bijuu's chakra being emitted, and so followed it here. I had thought it might be you, but..." The Konoha nin trailed off, and Naruto imagined that he was perhaps gazing in the direction of the Rakubi. Hokage-sama would probably find 2 Jinchuriki more useful than 1. "With a limited supply of air, you will eventually succumb to oxygen deprivation, allowing me to restrain the other Jinchuriki. You will not be able to break out of my Makuta ninjutsu." Naruto knew his enemy was right, his head was already starting to feel a little fuzzy. Previous experience had taught him that the man's would release affinity was extraordinarily durable and that cutting through it with something like wind chakra was out of the question. Not only would Tenzo have reinforced the prison holding him due to his prior escapes, but as a dual element, would release would be stronger than either earth or water release separately. Fortunately, he realized with sudden clarity, he also had a dual element bloodline limit at his disposal. Even better, the lightning element of storm release was strong against the earth portion of wood release, and the water parts would cancel. Naruto had the advantage. Cramped as he was in the cube, the blonde decided he would have to activate the technique on his own power instead of Jeong's. He used the threads to resituate the appropriate heart in his chest, and immediately he could sense both the prickle of lightning and fluidity of water. Forming seals, he channeled chakra until a nimbus of glowing energy formed around his hands. Ranten, Hikari Taiho. A blast of blue-white light, 2 feet in diameter, exploded from his hands and gouged a hole through the front wall of his prison. When the storm release, light cannon ended, Naruto wriggled his way out of the wooden construct and somersaulted to his feet. "That was pretty cool," he admitted, admiring the trail of destruction that disappeared into the forest. "Now, where'd that boss, Tenzo melted out of the earth before Naruto, his right shoulder and bicep missing a piece of sleeve and bearing a burn mark. "You're skilled," the Anbu told Naruto, or more specifically, the blonde's head, he had just been buried up to his chin in dirt. "At the very least, your mastery of the elements is quite impressive." He withdrew his sword from its sheath and held it so the handle was facing Naruto, then brought it down in a swift movement to knock him out. A wall of earth rose in front of the blonde's head, catching the Anbu's wrist before it connected. The ground began to quake, and in short order, Naruto was free from his confines, sitting atop his earth heart thread creature. "I know," he stated a bit smugly. "You should tell my teacher you think so." The thread creature broke Tenzo's wrist, but the man's form became wooden and immobile. "Moku Bunshin no Jutsu, damn, this guy's good." He took off his second shirt and looped it around his waist so it wouldn't get lost or ruined. "But I have a fight to get back to and a teacher to piss off, so..." The bandages around his arm were completely shredded as both limbs extended, the masks for his fire and storm elements becoming situated in the spread of threads to either side of his head, his wind heart now residing in his chest. In the process, his earth heart remerged with his body. A tongue of tendrils slipped out of his mouth, forked like a serpent's. "Come and get me," he hissed. Wooden tendrils arced towards him from the left, and Naruto jumped to the right as his storm mask released a thin beam of light that spliced through the attack. The blonde performed hand signs, exhaling a blast of wind right after his fire mask unleashed a wave of flames, turning the surrounding foliage into cinders. Tremors shook the earth, forcing Naruto to use his elongated limbs to stretch for an intact tree and hang there while the ground split open. He swung over the chasm Tenzo's technique had created and found purchase on a bough on the opposite side, where the leaf shinobi's initial attack had come from. Blue eyes searched the landscape for any sign of an approaching assault. They widened in surprise when his periphery caught Tenzo emerging from his tree's trunk, mere feet away, hands formed into some sort of massive wooden mallet. The man brought the makeshift weapon to bear, and Naruto found himself immensely thankful to Jeong, whose threads came from around his back to take the brunt of the blow. Still, the force of it sent him plummeting to the ground below, where earthen spikes awaited him. Naruto called upon the threads to encompass him, and they jumped to do his bidding, encasing him in a sphere of black that, hardened by his chakra, cocooned him from Tenzo's trap. When the tendrils returned to their previous state, the blonde found himself surrounded by the broken remains of rocky stalagmites. "Those threads are very durable," echoed Tenzo's voice, "and versatile. You have no idea." Based on observing the man's actions, he had an idea for a trap that would end the fight. He fully extruded his fire and lightning hearts, the fifth one still stored on his back, underneath the threads, and had the creatures start scouring the forest, unleashing ninjutsu to force the Anbu out of hiding. While his enemy was, presumably, distracted, Naruto slipped his earth heart out from his back and into the ground via the hiding in rock technique. Eventually, the flashes of lightning and fire that were tearing through the forest ceased, and Naruto was fully prepared when a wooden beam sprouted from the earth and twined around his body. It stopped suddenly at his hips, and then the ground shook and exploded upward in a shower of soil. The thread creature that housed his earth heart had Tenzo trapped within its body, tendrils of Jeong holding his arms to the side in a sort of crude crucible, but recalled both his fire and lightning hearts, and allowed the kinjutsu sprouting from his body to bury under his skin, returning his appearance to normal. The masks took their rightful places on his back. He continued to stay motionless, waiting to see if Tenzo had some sort of way out and was waiting for him to become more vulnerable to enact it. When that didn't happen for several minutes, he took a step forward until he was only feet from where the man was restrained. "So, it's come to this. You've been a bit of a thorn in my side, you know? But I guess I should thank you. After all, because of you, I'm about to get my hands on one of the most powerful Kekkei Genkai the world has ever known." He paused, then tilted his head to the side, as if considering an interesting curio. "I guess Konoha has done more for me than I originally gave it credit for. My thanks," he finished sardonically, pretending to doff a hat. Then he held out his arm, and Jeong's threads reached out to writhe into his enemy's body. There were only so many rules in Anbu, but the chief one was that, if an operative got caught or was mortally wounded, said person destroyed his body. It was unforgivable to allow any secrets of the hidden leaf to fall into the enemy's hands. That rule was even more important for Tenzo, who was the only inheritor of the Shodai Hokage's famed Makuten bloodline. Most Anbu were taught a seal to perform to do so. Tenzo had been ordered to create wood clone after wood clone and have them die in order to make sure he could perform the action seamlessly. His body burst into blue flames, and soon there was nothing left of the Anbu known as Tenzo. Naruto gaped openly, eventually using a mild water jutsu to put out the fire on the thread creature possessing his earth heart. It returned to his body like all the others as the blonde bemoaned the loss of such a powerful Kekkei Genkai. Then he turned to face the area where the roundish figure of a blue-white blob could still be seen. At least something still has the potential to go right. LLL. Kakuzu jumped back as his wind and water hearts expelled their respective elements, creating a powerful barrier against the wave of acidic fluid that barreled towards him. He was in a mid-range form that utilized his remaining elemental masks without putting his actual body in jeopardy, unlike the long-armed, two-hearted form, which used the limb's reach to attack the opponent. The old Nukenin had decided to disallow his useful thread creatures to roam free when his fire heart had been vaporized in a stream of alkaline solution emitted by the six tails. Now the former Taki Nin had a sort of shell of thread sprouting from his back and protecting as high as his neck. His Akatsuki cloak had been discarded to the side long ago. His water, lightning, and wind hearts were fixed in the spread of threads over each shoulder, the latter two over the right one. Otherwise, he looked much like he usually did. Jeong on its own had proven to be surprisingly ineffective against the Jinchuriki turned Bijou, as the massive slug possessed a layer of viscous slime that made anything it touched dissolve upon contact. In addition, the creature's body was rather malleable, making it semi-impervious to both taijutsu, not that that was really an option, due to the slime, and other physically reliant attacks, such as any Earth-released ninjutsu the bounty hunter had tried to use. Hidan had also proven to be, predictably, rather useless, even after disregarding his partner's warning to not get involved. Unlike the Nibi, the Rakubi wasn't made of chakra he could collect, and his triple-bladed scythe couldn't dig into the slug's squishy skin. Kakuzu was grateful for his massive chakra capacity and the wide variety of ninjutsu in his arsenal, because otherwise the battle wouldn't have been going nearly as well as it was. Still, he needed some sort of method to actually inflict damage on the Rakubi. Large reserves aside, Kakuzu had little doubt that a Bijou could outlast him in the chakra department. Utakata's mine, Kakuzu. A powerful beam of bright light accompanied this shout, striking the Rakubi's back and causing the massive blue-white slug to unleash a gurgling shriek. Naruto used the moment of distraction to rush past the tailed beast and confront his teacher, a nimbus of glowing energy surrounding his hands. Kakuzu eyed the unusual chakra with his usual detachment. "You took far longer than I expected to return," he noted. "Your skills have become even more mediocre than I imagined possible." Naruto ignored the slight. "I had some interference, but nothing will prevent me from claiming what's mine." Blue eyes glinted with steely determination. "Not even you?" "Yes, so you have said," returned the Nukenin dryly. Another wind and water collaboration held off another attack from the Rakubi, allowing Kakuzu to consider his options. The former Taki Nin would prefer not to fight both the blonde and the Bijou simultaneously, as the massive slug would require most of his concentration to bring down. But if his pupil wanted to stake his claim to the Jinchuriki, perhaps there was a way to manipulate his legacy into helping him. "I would like to propose collaborating to provide a mutually beneficial conclusion." "You want to work together? You?" The blonde paused, considering the idea. A smirk suddenly came over his features. "You can't take that thing on by yourself," he realized. "I am perfectly capable of doing such a thing," Kakuzu retorted, a bit testily, "but given your desire to continue your quest and go about this laborious task myself. Take it or leave it." Naruto waffled for a moment before acquiescing, though his expression was sour. Even if he truly wanted to take down Utakata, or the beast he had transformed into, by himself, he was smart enough to acknowledge, "You've been fighting this thing, so, what's the plan?" "The Rakubi is covered in an acidic slime that makes its body resistant to most attacks," Kakuzu explained. "I believe that a strong fire attack would take care of it and make the Bijou vulnerable to an assault." "Well, why haven't you tried that yet?" "My heart was destroyed," explained the older shinobi, scowling, "and while I can perform the required techniques without it, I might as well take advantage of you being here." Naruto didn't bother responding, instead running through seals, biting his thumb, and slamming his palm onto the ground. Kamagoka appeared in a cloud of smoke. The chameleon inhaled as the blonde began to run through more seals. "Ready?" raced along the ground, creating a ring of flames that surrounded the Rakubi. Simultaneously, he performed hand signs and the wind mask opened its beak to reveal a spiraling mass of air. Futon, Atsugai. The addition of the pressure damage technique to the conflagration already around the Bijou caused the flames to rise into a blazing inferno. Both thread users could hear the high-pitched burbling of the massive slug from inside the whirlwind of fire. "Attack," Kakuzu intoned, forming more hand signs. Uzumaki no Jutsu. It took every ounce of self-control Naruto had to not say something about his teacher's technique. He twisted his fingers through the seals for the Ranten, Hikari Taiho as a combination of wind, water, and lightning from Kakuzu's three hearts pierced the wall of flames and assailed the Rakubi. The bluish-white energy beam followed shortly thereafter, resulting in an increase in the Bijou's wailing. It took several minutes for the vortex of fire to taper out, and when it did, the blue-white form of the Rakubi had also disappeared. In the slug's place was a red-skinned and unconscious Utakata, his blue kimono absent and his black pants charred. "You know, we make a pretty good team," Naruto mentioned, blue eyes staring at the immobile form of his quarry. Kakuzu grunted, absorbing the tendrils of his kinjutsu back into his body and allowing his masks to settle on his back. "Do not get used to such an event. I am already forced to put up with one moron. I would prefer not to make a habit of getting involved with another." Naruto waved a hand to dismiss both Kamagoka and Kakuzu's comment and peered around the area. "Hey, where is Hidan, anyway?" The older thread user picked up his Akatsuki cloak and put it on. "He was interfering in my assignment, so I was forced to get rid of him." "You killed him?" "If only. He is simply indisposed." Kakuzu walked over and picked up Utakata, hefting the adolescent over his shoulder. "Your help was appreciated," he granted slowly, as if the word was distasteful. "Now, I must find my partner." Naruto withheld a snort of amusement at the disgust in his teacher's voice. Clearly his opinion of Hidan hadn't improved. Hey, wait. His teacher stopped and rolled his shoulder to indicate he was listening. Let me take him to Pain. I still want the bounty on his head. Kakuzu seemed to consider his offer for a moment before, in a gesture that surprised the blonde, dropping Utakata on the ground. I will be contacting Pain to let him know of your impending arrival. The blonde blinked. He hadn't really expected that to work. Thanks. Your platitudes are meaningless. Of course they are, he muttered. He opened his mouth to say something to the taller Nuknin about how old his bingo book was, or how he hadn't appreciated being added to the bingo book himself, but then stopped. On a day where Kakuzu was being strangely amiable, at least in this moment, the blonde was better off not pushing his luck. He could silently curse his mentor for what he had done, regardless of the fact that he had received the ranton element due to him, but Kakuzu was quite sure what he was referring to. His gratitude seemed a good thing to offer to cover the blanket of things his teacher had done for him. Kakuzu merely inclined his head and left to go, presumably, find Hidan. Naruto bent down and slung the other Jinchuriki over his shoulder before taking off to Otogakur. LLL. Zetsu ran into him part of the way back to Otogakur, probably at Pain's behest, and took the Rakubi Jinchuriki, stating that it was better to seal the creature before the male awoke. Naruto took his time returning to the hidden sound, making it back in a little more than a day. In an effort to wait out the sealing ritual, the blonde merely wandered around town until the time came for him to return for the bounty. He was leaning against the inner wall of Pain's tower when Konan eventually appeared from a hidden stairwell 2 days later. The blue-haired woman walked past him and out into the village, and after several minutes, Akatsuki's leader appeared. Pain stopped and stared at him with his strange, gray eyes. You may take the body at your convenience, he intoned. Thanks. The blonde made his way for the stairwell, but Pain's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Before you do that, he began, we have things to discuss. Chapter 19, Idealism. Pain stood with his back to Naruto, gazing out over the buildings that constituted the hidden sound from the top of his tower. Neither male had spoken since the former had insisted that they talk, the younger one merely following his elder up to his lookout spot. Given that he'd done everything asked of him since meeting Pain, Naruto wondered what the leader of Akatsuki wanted to talk to him about. And when he'd actually say something. The orange-haired man chose that moment to open his mouth, though he was still facing away from Naruto. I spoke with Kakuzu after we finished sealing the Rakubi. Naruto wasn't sure what to say to that. Though he was unsure as to what happened during the sealing ritual, talking one-on-one with a fellow member of Akatsuki was probably rather unusual. Pain wouldn't bother bringing it up otherwise. The fact that he was speaking to Kakuzu, well, the topic was likely centered around only one subject, him. That was kind of funny, since whenever he was in Kakuzu's company, his teacher almost never had anything good to say. Even when he did, it was almost always done in some sort of backhanded fashion. Anything the nonagenarian would tell someone else about him was unlikely to be positive. A sort of morbid curiosity overtook him, but unsure where exactly the older shinobi was going, he merely said, "Oh." Pain spared him an over-the-shoulder glance. "You sound uninterested." The younger male shuffled awkwardly. Even Kakuzu's piercing stares didn't make him nearly as uncomfortable as a mere look from Pain's unique eyes. "Kakuzu doesn't often have much nice to say about me," he admitted, "and you haven't said what you talked with him about. I'm not really sure what to say right now." Akatsuki's leader hummed thoughtfully. "Yes, you and your mentor have quite the unusual relationship." "Tell me something I don't know, named Kuji. Tell me," he continued, turning around to face the blonde, "what would prompt you to help capture another Jinchuriki?" "Well, I didn't know he was a Jinchuriki at first," he admitted. "Kakuzu's bingo book is so damn old that." "You're using his bingo book?" Pain interjected. Naruto nodded, and the older man blinked slowly. "Interesting. Continue." Naruto wasn't sure why Pain would describe what Kakuzu would consider useless sentimentality as interesting, but he didn't question it. "Anyway, I was trying to." He paused, thinking of the right words. "Somehow, prove to my wayward teacher that he's wrong about me by invading Kirigakure and killing one of its esteemed shinobi didn't really feel like the right thing to say. He had a high bounty, according to the book, he finally settled on, and I wanted to get him. But then Kakuzu showed up and said that Utakata was his, and I didn't just want to let him show me up, so." He had started rambling, and Pain held up a hand to forestall the rest of his diatribe. The orange-haired man seemed to have drawn his own conclusion based on the blonde's words. "That explains your original motivation. And yet, once you found out he was a Jinchuriki, you still chose to stay and neutralize him." "I didn't want to get shown up," he defended. Now that he was saying it, his reasoning sounded rather dumb and childish. Pain decided not to comment on it, instead turning around and resuming his watch over Otogakur. Zetsu located the Hachibi. I sent Itachi and Kisame out to capture the Jinchuriki. When he didn't immediately continue speaking, Naruto shifted uncomfortably. What was he supposed to say to that? Oh. Yes, Pain confirmed, and Naruto wondered if the man thought he'd reached some sort of obvious conclusion or if he was just agreeing for the sake of it. When the Hachibi is sealed, the only Jinchuriki remaining will be you and your associate. The blonde tensed. Did he keep me here to kill me now? With his back still turned, the motion went unnoticed by Pain. Due to the nature of the sealing statue, the Kyuubi must be sealed last. Naruto's muscles relaxed at the same time Akatsuki's leader shot him another over-the-shoulder look. You are safe until such time as we can capture the Nanabi. Naruto wasn't sure whether that statement was meant to be reassuring or not. It sounded kind of like it, but the knowledge that Fu's death was the only thing standing in the way of his own was not as comforting as Pain made it out to be. Joy. Do you have goals you'd like to achieve? Come again? Pain turned to face him fully and actually strode forward, only a number of feet separated them now. Goals, he repeated. Something to strive for. Naruto wasn't quite sure what to say. Sure, there were some things that he would have liked to have occurred before he died. Receiving Kakuzu's praise was near the top of that list, though the likelihood of that occurring was slim, regardless of the timetable on his death. Most of the other things weren't exactly goals so much as things he would have liked to grow up and try, given the opportunity to become an adult. His mind flickered around for an idea, and finally latched on to the one that had been driving him since meeting Kakuzu so many years ago. I want vengeance against Konoha, he settled on. That is a lofty objective. Yeah, I know, but... You did not let me finish, Pain interrupted. Naruto fell silent at the man's words, unwilling to get on his bad side. The other male kind of controlled his fate, after all. As I was saying, getting vengeance upon Konoha is an impressive goal, but not an impossible one. Nor are you the only one who desires it. Naruto connected the dots almost immediately. You? Konohagakure has done much to earn my wrath, and it has profited far too much from the tragedy that has befallen others. Seeing it razed to the ground would be quite satisfying. He turned his back to Naruto, walked forward, and beckoned for the boy to approach. The blonde found himself standing beside Akatsuki's leader, overlooking the village hidden in sound. Do you know what Akatsuki's goal is? Naruto was slightly taken aback by the question, but he recovered quickly. Isn't it to use the bijou to control war and then the world? That is what I would have the other members believe, Pain stated. Naruto's ears perked at the admission, suddenly aware that the orange-haired man was bringing him into his confidence. It was either a sign of his faith in the blonde, or an omen of his impending death that Pain could reveal such sensitive information and not fear it leaking. So, what's the actual goal? My true intention is to create a Kinjutsu that will annihilate one of the 5 great shinobi nations, which will set an example for the others in order to discourage them from engaging in warfare. This will create a world where Akatsuki controls the struggle of power that has always existed amongst the hidden villages, a world which lives under the same umbrella of fear, of pain, a world where peace reigns. You're fighting for peace? Pain spared the younger male a sidelong glance. Do you take offense to that? Naruto returned the look and blinked blankly. No, it's just surprising, that's all. I didn't really expect you to be trying to achieve something so good. The orange-haired man returned his gaze to the city below. Long ago, I used to live in Amigakure. It was a place that was always strife with war because of its location among the lands of fire, earth, and wind. The shinobi world wars created many casualties, including both of my parents and my closest friend. It was his desire to become the leader of Amigakure, and then become something more, in order to prevent war from taking place. Only by controlling the world could he instigate and enforce peace. After his death, I swore to continue his dream. To that end, I learned of the existence of the bijou. By utilizing their collective power, I could control a force strong enough to accomplish the same end as my friend. The ends justify the means. Why are you telling me this? Asked the Jinchuriki, apprehensive of the answer. Because we are similar, Pain stated. Our histories may be different, but we have lived through many of the same experiences. You're also quite intriguing, an anomaly of sorts. I did not expect you to be so useful when Kakuzu advised I speak to you upon his joining Akatsuki. Your dedication to your self-imposed mission is quite impressive. He turned ringed eyes upon the teen. In many ways, you also remind me of my friend. It's refreshing. Nostalgic. Ah. Naruto wasn't quite sure what else to say. He never would have guessed Pain's real intentions for Akatsuki. They were just too outlandish for such a powerful figure, especially one who portrayed himself as interested in world domination. On the other hand, he also understood why Pain had never shared his plans with the other members. If any of the S-class Nukenin found out what their leader's true aspirations were, it was highly unlikely that they would have wanted to remain a part of the organization. And Pain needed them in order to collect all the bijou so his plans could come to fruition. It was manipulative as hell, but also very clever. Regardless, Naruto still felt like he was on the wrong end of Pain's objectives. Your relationship with your teacher is quite unusual. And now he was confused. Pain kept switching topics too quickly for him to properly keep track of. Huh? Your relationship with Kakuzu, the Ame-nin repeated. It's strange. Naruto thought that was a mild way to describe how they got along, but the older man apparently wasn't done with his musing. At first glance, one would assume that you hated each other, given how you converse and interact, but that is a false assumption. Despite the animosity you seem to show each other, your relationship is quite strong. You desire his attention and acceptance, probably due to how he reared you. How did you? Pain preempted his question. I am no stranger to the quest for acknowledgement. Additionally, only the strongest feelings of devotion would keep you working near him when he is hunting members of your kind. Naruto huffed and crossed his arms, but didn't deny the claim. On the other hand, continued the orange-haired male, I believe that Kakuzu views you as a reminder of how far he has come. It is hard to say, but I think that he considers you to be a younger version of himself. Naruto, once again, couldn't formulate a response, though this time it was more due to shock. He wasn't stupid enough to believe that Kakuzu didn't care about him, even if it was hidden by indifference and disparaging remarks, but to have someone else point it out was something quite different. Pain had to be a rather perceptive individual to pick up on the sorts of clues that would lead to that conclusion, especially if he was reading them off of someone as emotionally detached as Kakuzu. He also wasn't done talking. I have the distinct impression that he would be highly disappointed if you, at least, were sacrificed on behalf of Akatsuki's goals. Every time I have brought up the topic of your impending death, he has found ways to persuade me to prolong it, though always in a very subtle fashion. Kakuzu is clever, and his methods are very surreptitious, but his tenacity in avoiding the subject of allowing you to die is very telling. Naruto felt a small amount of gratitude swell in his chest at the notion that his teacher cared enough to fight for his life, even if the old Nukenin never showed such sentiment when they ran into each other. I appreciate you telling me that, I suppose, he added, still unsure where Pain was going with their meeting. I've decided, Pain began in a voice Naruto would have considered magnanimous if it wasn't so flat, that you and your friend are greater assets to me alive than dead. You're not going to take the Kyuubi from me? No. I've discovered an alternate method to use the bijou that won't require a complete extraction, though I'll still require access to the Nanabi's and Kyuubi's chakras. That's great. I'm going to live. Fu's going to live. We can. His thought trailed off, unsure where to go from there. The memory of Fu kissing him was still relatively fresh in his mind, and though he hadn't consciously thought much of it after the initial moment, due to his focus on simply surviving to his next birthday, it suddenly appeared as if he had the time to consider his future, and who that future could contain. That rather expansive thought process was cut off by Pain. Unfortunately, I have an associate who will be less than pleased about such a course of action. It will take some persuasion to sway him. Naruto frowned a little at how ominous that sounded, but decided not to question it. I would like to ask a favor of you, as compensation. Yeah, sure, anything you want, Naruto affirmed, deciding that it behooved him to be gracious. It is my desire to free Amiga Core from the clutches of Hanzo the Salamander. While I have every intention of taking him down personally, Naruto noted that the orange-haired man sounded a little vindictive when he said that. The less of his forces I have to deal with, the better. I would like you, he stated, fixing Naruto with a gray-eyed stare, to infiltrate Amiga Core and create an opening for me to reach Hanzo. Naruto blinked at the unexpected request. Oh, well, sure, that seems doable. Pain nodded once. Good. There is already an operative of Akatsuki's working on the same mission within Amiga Core. You should meet up with him. I expect you two to be able to get me access to Hanzo as soon as possible. Anything else? No. He turned and strode away from the blonde. Take the Rakubi Jinchuriki's body on your way out and finish your mission. I wish you luck. Yeah, thanks, hey. He called before Pain completely disappeared into a hidden doorway that had just opened. What was your friend's name? The one you said I reminded you of. Yahiko, Pain replied after a pause. He went through the door and allowed it to shut behind him, leaving Naruto in the building by himself. Well, time to get down to business. LLL. While it is amusing to watch the Hachibi get thrashed by mere humans, I would like to suggest leaving this place. Upon his capture, you will be one of the few Jinchuriki left to roam freely, and I would prefer not to share the fate of my brethren. Fu didn't respond to the Nanabi, choosing instead to continue observing the battle occurring before her very eyes. Given how far away she was, it was difficult to tell what was happening, though the Hachibi's massive size made his movements much easier to see, but judging by the pair of black-cloaked figures, the height difference between them, and the simply massive amount of water the taller one had just conjured, Kisame and Itachi were working to neutralize the eight tails as quickly as possible. Even if the beetle was worried for himself, Fu wanted an idea of what was going on with Akatsuki, and better yet, how they fought against a summoned Bijou. It was actually a huge coincidence that had led to her current situation. She had entered the Land of Lightning on a bounty hunt for a blonde male with a specialty in kata ninjutsu. After skimming the bingo book, she had been rather amused to find a description of Naruto in it, and deciding that her skill in earth ninjutsu stood a better chance against him than a white-haired male who could channel lightning chakra through his sword. Crossing the region had been an interesting experience, given that she had mostly been exploring the veritable wasteland of the Land of Earth, but given that she wasn't on any particular timetable, she hadn't been too worried about taking her time. Finding the man hadn't taken all that long. Apparently he was somewhat of a loudmouth, and the green-haired girl had taken great pleasure in shutting him up by killing him. Honestly, if he had said hot one more time, Fu would have blown a gasket. The storage scroll that Naruto had bestowed upon her had never been more useful than in that moment. Fu didn't fancy trying to trek back over the mountains that compose the Land of Lightning with a heavy body slung over her shoulders. It was during this journey that the sound of a roar had reached her ears, and the head of a massive reddish-brown, ox-like creature had crested the nearby mountain ridge. Curious but wary, she had decided to find a better spot to see what was going on. It had been quite a while since Fu had given Akatsuki any serious thought. That wasn't to say that she'd forgotten about them. The threat the organization posed to her life was all too real for that comfort, but she didn't see the purpose in worrying over something that was out of her control. Either Akatsuki would decide that it needed the Nanabi and come after her, or it wouldn't, and if its members did decide to pursue her, she would fight back until her body was broken and immobile. Whether she was strong enough to fend them off didn't really matter. Her focus was on improving her skills for her own benefit, not to meet a certain plateau in power and peak there. She was well aware of the fact that her actions had little bearing on Akatsuki's decision to keep her alive or not. Naruto was the one with connections to many of the members, Kakuzu, Itachi, Kisame, Pain, and it was him who would make the difference on whether their lives were forfeit or not for her lack of trying to be useful, of course. The green-haired girl reflected on that thought. Things always seemed to return to her blonde companion in the end. When she had still been a member of Takigakure, Kakuzu had been her idol simply because of the reputation he carried. Humanity had spurned her existence, just as it had done to Kakuzu generations before. The Nukenin had embodied everything that Fu wished she had in order to escape the hellhole that was the hidden waterfall and be free to do as she desired. And so, when Naruto had arrived and given her the opportunity to fulfill her dreams, it had been the greatest moment of her short life. Reality, however, was very different from fantasy. Fu had held no illusions that Kakuzu was a nice person. In fact, she would have been somewhat disappointed if he had turned out to be one. He was a cruel man with a penchant for giving priority to the object with the most value. That object, apparently, was Naruto. Kakuzu's expectations for her had been very clear. She was a tool meant to spur Naruto to bigger and better things. That hadn't put her off from reaping the benefits of being the Nukenin's tool, though it had started a slow shift of perspective on who her idol should really be. While Kakuzu was a superb shinobi and a good mentor when he truly put forth the effort, Naruto had slowly become her motivation to keep moving forward. When that had turned into infatuation, well, Fu honestly hadn't been all that surprised. She was still a girl, after all, and the only males in her life were Kakuzu and Naruto. Given the former's personality and age versus the latter's understanding and kinship forged from being a Jinchuriki, her interest in the blonde had really only been a matter of time. How far those feelings extended was still questionable. It would have been easy to say that she loved him, except that she had no measure for what constituted love. How was she supposed to know what the difference between casual interest and love was without any other friends or associates to compare against? Kakuzu didn't count, he was a statistical anomaly when it came to such matters. Still, she knew she felt something for her fellow Jinchuriki, and those feelings had culminated in the simple desire to show him some form of affection, the kiss. She had already decided previous to that moment that it would be wiser to split up. Kakuzu's training had given both of them enough of a power boost that venturing together would be more of a hindrance to their respective safety and future profitability than a boon. Fu knew that, if Akatsuki should decide to seal the Nanabi and Kyubi, she would be the first one targeted, either because of necessity or because Kakuzu would subtly prod pain into keeping Naruto alive for as long as he possibly could. Naruto, after all, was more valuable. It wasn't necessarily the possibility of never seeing him again that had spurred her into kissing him, though she would have been lying to say it hadn't played a small part in her decision. The knowledge that Naruto had done so much for her, some things even without his direct awareness, combined with her desire to let him know that there was a life beyond simply bounty hunting and trying to survive Akatsuki, had galvanized her into at least attempting to show him how she felt. Of course, whether or not he actually returned her feelings was another matter entirely. Judging only by how little he had responded during the kiss, she would have had to guess that they weren't on the same wavelength, though that could have been chalked up to shock and inexperience. She had signs before she was even aware of what she was doing. The Nanabi, however, took notice. "What are you doing?" He sounded almost apprehensive about the way his container's fingers twisted around each other. "I'm tired of sitting back and doing nothing," she muttered, holding her hands out in the classic position required for using Jinten. "Foolish girl." This time, the tinge of panic in the beetle's buzzing was quite audible. "While I have no issue with putting the Hachibi in his place, his capture brings us one step closer to death." "They'll eventually capture the Hachibi, with or without my help," Fu shot back, sweat beginning to trickle down her face. "Kakuzu said that Itachi and Kisame are the strongest pair within Akatsuki. They wouldn't have been sent if they couldn't do the job." "Then let them do it. You are risking both of our lives by interfering." "I don't care. What will be, will be." If nothing else, Kakuzu's pragmatism had certainly rubbed off on his female pupil. "Now shut up, I'm trying to concentrate." Fu had discovered that it was easier to manipulate the form the atomizing powers granted to her by the Nanabi took after summoning them in the geometric shape described by the scroll Pain had given her. It was too difficult to focus on the tri-elemental nature manipulation and the shape manipulation simultaneously, so after creating a square pyramidal base of dust release in her hands, she could change the form to something more useful to the situation. Unfortunately, it was still an art in the making, requiring some measure of concentration, and the Seven Tails buzzing panic wasn't conducive to what she was trying to achieve. After another several moments, the technique was straining against her hold on it. She released it with a powerful burst of chakra. Jinten, Kuryudan no Jutsu. A massive dragon erupted from her hands, opaque and grayish-brown in color. It roared through the air and crashed through two of the Hachibi's tentacles, disintegrating them upon contact. Fu almost wished that she was close enough to see the surprise on Kisame's and Itachi's faces. Well, if Itachi had the capacity to display emotion, anyway. In the back of her mind, she hoped that her assistance in the capture of the Hachibi would be noted and added to her list of useful qualities as a reason for Akatsuki to not kill her. The diversion apparently did its job, for Itachi took the Biju's lull in attacking to cause great swathes of black flames to erupt all over the Hachibi's skin. Simultaneously, all the water in the area rose up and encompassed the Biju, trapping it in what Fu guessed to be some sort of enlarged water prison technique. Strangely, the black fire continued to burn the beast's skin, despite being underwater. Though it was difficult to tell what was happening, Fu watched as Kisame stepped into the bubble of water, and soon enough the Hachibi was shrinking down in size. Water splashed down into the valley of mountains as the forms of two humans became distinguishable, the Hachibi Jinchuriki and Kisame. "Now that you have assisted the enemy in accomplishing their task," rasped the Nanabi acidly, "perhaps you will finally heed my advice and leave." "Yeah, I think it's time to go. Bounties to turn in, after all," she thought, patting the side of her cylinder, where the scroll containing a plethora of sealed corpses was hidden. "Foolish girl, you will come to regret this mistake." "We'll see." Then she took off, crossing the mountains as quickly as possible. Blood-red and beady yellow eyes followed her path as she left. "Should we follow her?" Itachi was silent for a long moment. "No," he replied at last. "She is not our assignment." Unspoken, the Uchiha mused that Fu's escape would prolong the amount of time he had to work up a plan to save Naruto from an unnecessary death. Missing nin, who roamed the world by their very nature, were far more difficult to track down than shinobi belonging to villages, such as the Hachibi Jinchuriki. The amount of time it had taken Kakuzu to find the Rakubi Jinchuriki was proof enough of that. All he could hope was that Fu and Naruto could endure until he could arrive at a solution. "Come," he intoned, "we should contact Leader Sama and have Zetsu bring the body to base before he awakens. I have no desire to restrain the Hachibi a second time." "Hey, as you say, Itachi. Personally, that was the most fun I've had in a while. The raven-haired male didn't respond. Kisame's definition of fun had always been a bit peculiar, blood-red eyes flickering once more in the direction Fu had disappeared in. Survive. LLL. Naruto sat at one of the many round, wooden tables in the bar, back to the rest of the patrons. Mildly irritated, he took to stirring his tonic water with his straw, ears pricked for any indication of interesting or informative conversation. Even if he could drink alcohol, he was still underage, though a quick henge would render that fact inconsequential. He would rather remain sober by not imbibing. Keeping his faculties about him was important while deep within enemy territory. Despite having eagerly agreed to Pain's request, Naruto had become extremely grumpy since infiltrating the Hidden Rain, a task that had been surprisingly difficult to accomplish. Years of warfare and invasion had taught the citizens to be wary of any outsiders, and the borders of the small nation were under constant surveillance. Hanzo's legendary paranoia probably lent some explanation to the heavy guard as well. Eventually, he had opted into using Mizugakure no Jutsu to slip into one of the drainage streams leaving the Hidden Rain. Travel against the flow of liquid had been slow going, but he'd managed to slip into the village undetected after some effort. That had led to him wandering the village in an attempt to get any relevant information to accomplish what Pain had asked of him. Most of his irritability stemmed from the simple misery that Amigakure exuded. Aptly named, rain never seemed to stop falling in the village, or the country, for that matter, and the relentless downpour made roaming the streets an unpleasant venture. Displeased with the climate, Naruto had walked into the first shop he'd found, after taking off his /hitty-8 and using henge to alter his hair color, and bought a rain slicker to toss over his clothes. As he had continued to meander around the Hidden Rain, he'd wondered why Pain would even want to liberate a place that was so steeped in despondency. He took a quick sip of his drink in an attempt to draw his thoughts away from something so depressing. Perhaps that was exactly why Pain wanted to take over Amigakure, to provide a better opportunity for the people of his homeland. Not that he knew exactly what the orange-haired man could do to improve the lives of the denizens of the Hidden Rain, but it certainly seemed logical. He could sort of empathize with that feeling. Before he had left Pain's tower in Otogakure, Konan had approached him with a small book. She had informed him in a rather bland voice that continuous combing of Orochimaru's archives had revealed a small source of information on the Uzumaki clan, and all of it was contained in the text now in his hands. Naruto had left the hidden sound with a quiet but appreciate thanks for the blue-haired woman, blue eyes already delving into the history of the family he had never known. His reading had revealed Uzushio-gakure, the former home of his clan, and in a decision driven more by curiosity and emotion than sensibility, he had been eavesdropping on were leaving. He waited a moment before throwing several coins on the table to cover his drink and then followed them out, immediately pulling the hood of his rain slicker over his head as he left the bar. Disappearing into an alley, he cloaked himself in the hiding and camouflage technique and took off after the pair. Amigakure, aside from being rainy all the damn time, was also a very confusing place. Metal skyscrapers were built practically on top of each other, all with twisting mazes of pipes trailing from top to bottom along their sides. Combined with the constant downpour, the dull gray metal of the buildings only added to the dreariness that the Hidden Rain emanated. The closeness of the skyscrapers also created thin streets to walk on, and there was little in the way of awnings to escape from the rain. Dark corners and slim alleyways were commonplace, providing a plethora of hiding places for anyone willing or able to squeeze into them. If he wasn't a ninja, Naruto might have been worried about getting mugged. The blonde scowled slightly as he walked along. Though Pain had told him there was someone for him to connect with already in Amigakure, he had neglected to give any more information, and Naruto had forgotten to ask. Finding a needle in a haystack. Naruto released a strangled gurgle as a kunai was buried and wavering into place from the surrounding rain, but the water droplets are still hitting you. It's easy for any trained shinobi to notice when a certain area isn't being pelted by rain in Amigakure. We don't take kindly to strangers here. Okay, didn't think of that, Naruto admitted. Damn new terrain, who the hell wants to live here, anyway? He could already feel his earth heart moving to take the place of his ruined Wind One. Distantly, he could hear the same Ame-nin ordering some others to check for any sort of identification or partners, as well as the bingo book for any outstanding bounty on his head. And wouldn't that be an ironic end? He ran through a mental tally of what he could do in his head. With all the rain, he was unlikely to be able to use his fire jutsu effectively, and the metal structures and lack of wide space eliminated earth jutsu as well. Given the destruction storm release was likely to cause, that was also out. That left lightning, water, and wind, not to mention Jeong. Subtly, he formed hand signs beneath his body, channeling his chakra into the puddles sitting in the cobblestone path. Suten, Mizu Kamikiri. An arc of water rose up, ready to bisect the Ame Nin, but there was a shout that alerted him to the water release, rising water slicer, and he dodged at the last second. He gave Naruto a hard stare as the blonde climbed to his feet. You should be dead. You'll discover it's a lot harder to kill me than that, the Jinchuriki returned, yanking the kunai from his chest and letting it clatter to the ground. As Jeong stitched together the wound, he noticed that there was a distinct lack of civilians around, though he was surrounded by a dozen Ame Nin. This seems familiar, he thought, uncomfortably aware that Kakuzu had been killed in much the same fashion. Apparently, the shinobi of the rain were more businesslike than he had assumed, for they all disappeared in a wavering haze without responding. Freaking genjutsu, he snarled, remembering Itachi's lessons. He immediately set about dispelling the illusions, but for every one that he managed to release himself from, 2 more popped into existence. Meanwhile, he could feel a variety of different blades biting into his skin, and he activated the earth spear technique reflexively to protect himself from the nuisances. Water swirled beneath his feet, and the blonde found himself suddenly restrained by 8 thick tendrils of liquid that twirled around his neck, arms, legs, and torso. It was highly reminiscent of the way he had killed many people in his adventures, and he felt a momentary pang of empathy for his victims. This kinda sucks. Suten, Tokuhoryu no Jutsu, whispered the voice of the same Ame Nin. Based on how quiet the voice was, Naruto noted that he was smart enough not to get too close, a fact which caused his respect for the shinobi of the Hidden Rain to rise marginally. You'll be unable to move and cast jutsu. People keep telling me that. I wonder if I just have a face that doesn't scream I have a powerful kinjutsu that makes all your restraining techniques completely ineffective. The blonde pondered that for a moment before shrugging it off as unimportant, focusing instead on breaking free of the bindings before the Ame Nin decided to break his neck. Ah well, pity I won't be able to see the surprise on his face when he's proven wrong. A pair of black whips burst out of each sleeve, imbued with wind chakra. They sliced through the watery grasp of the octopus hold technique and rotated perpendicular to his body in an insidious impression of a buzz saw. There was a scream of pain, though Naruto was a bit let down to note that that timbre of the voice wasn't the same as the Ame Nin who kept talking to him. Shame. Still unable to see his enemies because of whatever illusions they kept putting him under, Naruto opted to let Jeong seek out his enemies and destroy them. It wasn't nearly as gratifying as accomplishing the deed himself, but he needed to get away and re-establish some modicum of cover as soon as possible. Hanzo would undoubtedly try to scour the entirety of Amigakure in lieu of the loss of his forces, and the blonde needed a place where he could hunker down and wait for an opportunity to return to his mission. There were 2 more yells as his kinjutsu located and eviscerated opponents. Naruto briefly considered taking one of their hearts to replace his wind one, but then decided he didn't want to go through the hassle while in the middle of such a predicament. Suddenly, Naruto's eyes were drawn to a thin, almost invisible surge of blue-white light that flashed past his field of vision and lanced into the thin air 30 feet to his left. An accompanying scream was the only notice that it had passed through an Ame Nin before electricity arced out in several directions from the still invisible body, creating a web of what he recognized as lightning chakra with him at the center. When the lightning disappeared, Naruto found that the illusions were all gone, and the dead bodies of a dozen rain shinobi littered the ground, only a couple leaking blood from where he'd sliced into them with wind chakra. The red liquid was quickly becoming diluted by the constant downpour and growing puddles of Amigakure. He was distracted by the sound of someone landing behind him. Black tendrils snapped to attention, but Naruto paused in his assault when he took in the appearance of the person. The male before him wore the black pants and slate gray, long-sleeved shirt of an Amigakure jonin, bandages wrapped around his wrists and ankles, a lighter gray scarf was looped around his neck, and the 4 vertical lines denoting a member of the Hidden Rain decorated his hideate. Cobalt blue hair fell around his ears, but his bangs barely tickled his eyebrows, leaving stormy, gray eyes clearly visible. Naruto noted with some amusement that the other teenager was now an inch shorter than his own height of 5 feet 8 inches, and looked even paler than the last time they'd seen each other. Haro gave the blonde an amused smirk, replacing the twin katana kiba to their holster on his back. Hello, Naruto, or perhaps I should call you Shinobu? Still getting into trouble, I see. Naruto rolled his eyes good-naturedly. You have no idea. LLL. Nagato was grateful that it took very little concentration to actually keep both the Gentashi no Jutsu and Fuinjutsu, Janryu Kyufujin active. Both were essentially self-sustaining techniques after the initial activation as long as chakra was fed into them, or, perhaps more accurately, as long as there was chakra to be fed into them. For the most part, both techniques just siphoned chakra from the users over the direction they were kept active. Either way, it allowed for his mind to wander, and simultaneously ignore Hidan's inane rants, Tobi's nattering, and Datara proclamations about art, and focus on the decision he had made regarding Naruto as the Hachibi was sealed within the Gedo Mazo. Naruto was truly an intriguing individual. In many ways, the boy was a sort of kindred spirit to himself, not to mention a slight reminder of Yahiko. Aside from Konan, who knew it well from the keen loss of Yahiko, he was one of the few people Nagato knew of who had experienced the true definition of pain. Such a quality was so rare that sacrificing him for the statue was practically counterintuitive to the message he wanted to send the rest of the world. Not to mention that, in spite of himself, Nagato was a little curious to see how far his family member, no matter how distantly related they might be, would go in life. It was truly unfortunate that, out of all the people in the world, Naruto had been the one to be saddled with the burden of the Kyuubi. Then again, for the boy to have turned against the village he was born in and then work with people who could be considered his enemies was a true stroke of fortune. Given the results, Nagato's decision to keep an eye on Kakuzu as a potential recruit to Akatsuki all those years ago had turned out to be a very good one. Nagato wasn't stupid or naive enough to believe that the core members of Akatsuki would remain as such once his true plans came to fruition. They were all S-class missing nin, and with the exception of Konan, all of them were far more interested in murder, mayhem, and destruction than in world peace, no matter how it was achieved. Hidan would return to trying to spread his religion, Sasori would continue to pull strings in all the villages and collect more humans to increase his puppet collection, Kakuzu would go back to bounty hunting for profit. The most logical conclusion was that everyone would return to what they were doing before joining Akatsuki. But Naruto, and Fu, to a lesser extent, was different. The boy clearly held an attachment to Kakuzu, and it was possible that he would follow in his mentor's footsteps if allowed to live. However, given the former Taki nin's personality, the likelihood of the two thread users traveling together seemed small. Naruto understood some aspect of how pain operated and thought, and it was possible that after his revenge against Konoha was sated, he would be willing to work for the benefit of Amigakure, once Hanzo was dead, of course. It was this that made him and the girl, who was likely to follow him, valuable. While sealing the Nanabi and the Kyuubi into the demonic statue of the outer path would certainly grant Akatsuki more power, keeping two trained Jinchuriki with their respective bijou bolstered Nagato's forces immensely more than killing them. There were ways around their death, of course. As a wielder of the Rinnegan, Nagato could simply use Gedo, Rin Tensei no Jutsu to revive both Naruto and Fu after extracting their bijou, but there were issues with that. For one, the Samsara of Heavenly Life technique required a simply ridiculous amount of chakra and energy, and Nagato was already in poor health as it was. He didn't think it would outright kill him to bring back a mere two people, but given his already shortened lifespan, that option was less than optimal. Not to mention that the reincarnated Jinchuriki would be short their bijou, and thus less powerful and less useful than they could be otherwise. And while there might be ways to reseal the bijou into their hosts from the Gedo Mazo, doing so seemed counterproductive. Keeping Naruto and Fu alive was just easier and more sensible. But keeping them alive had its own problem, namely, Uchiha Madara, the man beneath Tobi's mask. Neither Konan nor Nagato trusted the supposed co-founder of Konohagakure, he was simply providing them a means to an end with the bijou. But now that the grey-eyed man had come up with an alternative method of enacting his own plan, his and Madara's goals were at odds. The man hadn't explained why it was vital that all of the bijou be sealed within the statue, but Nagato knew that there was no way to dissuade him from that objective. It made him highly suspicious of the Uchiha's motives, especially since he had pitched the idea of a Kinjutsu that could do all they desired without sealing the Nanabi and Kyuubi, and Madara had shot it down. If his true goal was aligned with the fake one Nagato had set up for the other Akatsuki members, or even his own goal, then there should have been no reason for the Uchiha to reject the proposition. After all, if he had accepted, they could have used the Kinjutsu almost immediately after sealing the Hachibi. But given that Madara had insisted on the remaining two bijou and Nagato knew they weren't needed, the Uzumaki finally had a reason to go against the other man's plans. The body of the Hachibi Jinchuriki hit the floor of the cavern with a dull thump. Pain blinked his ringed eyes once. "Our task is almost completed," he announced. "Zetsu, find the girl and report back when you've done so. The Nanabi must be sealed before the Kyuubi. We're so close. Celebrate later. We have work to do." The plant man's image fizzled out. "The rest of you, continue on with gathering funds." There was a brief curse from Hidan about how blasphemous such an action was, but Pain ignored it. "We will reconvene when the Nanabi is ready to be sealed." The other members took that as a sign of dismissal, their projections fizzling into nothingness. Konan's image remained lit. "You're sure you want to do this?" "Yes. It is clear that our ideals no longer align, and we are a mere step away from completing our objective." Pain focused and reactivated the magic lantern body technique, making sure to resonate the jutsu with only a handful of rings. In short order, the multicolored forms of Kakuzu, Hidan, Itachi, and Kisame were standing in their respective positions upon the Geto Mazo's fingertips. What the hell? Hidan voiced in irritation. Why are we back here? I have a special assignment for the four of you and Konan. There is a member within our ranks whose views no longer agree with Akatsuki's, and he must be eliminated. Who is the target? Kakuzu inquired. Gray eyes flickered over to him. Toby. Keihei, I'll almost be a little sad to see him go, Kisame snickered, sharp teeth bared in a smirk. He brought a bit of light into this gloomy organization. Where are the artist fags? Hidan cut in. I don't believe they have the same stake in this mission as the rest of you do, Pain responded. His eyes once more met Kakuzu's, and the bounty hunter inclined his head in understanding. Pain knew that the taller shinobi would fight for Naruto's right to live, and Hidan would fight alongside him simply for the opportunity to shed blood, and not have to collect money. Trusting Itachi and Kisame was a bit risky, but given that both had taught the blonde at different points, he was relying on the two having forged some sort of connection with Naruto to motivate them to fight against Toby. Deidara and Sasori had no such history with the boy. From his periphery, Pain thought he caught the slightest narrowing of Itachi's blood-red eyes. The Uchiha was even more difficult to read than Kakuzu, his body language and vocal intonation giving nothing away. It was impossible to tell whether he was insulted at the prospect of having to take down a fellow member of Akatsuki or excited for the opportunity to once more measure his capacity. You will all have to remain close to Oto Gakure in order to be prepared to partake in this assignment. Konan will be in charge of coordination, and she will brief you all on what to expect. As the blue-haired woman began to talk, Nagato once more allowed his mind to drift. He was doing the right thing. Naruto was too much like both himself and Yahiko to just die when he had the potential to be so much more. He could only hope that, while he freed Amiga Corps from its current leader, the combined might of Konan, Kakuzu, Hidan, Kisame, and Itachi would be enough to destroy the entity calling himself Uchiha Madara. Meanwhile, Uchiha Itachi listened with only half an ear to Konan's explanation of Toby's abilities, one distinct thought in mind. Finally, Chapter 20, Usurpation. So, what have you figured out? Haro fixed Naruto with a curious look. He remained standing as the blonde took a seat on the floor of the tower he had led them to, the same tower he'd been using as his base of operations for the past several months. Not that I'm ungrateful to see you or anything, he began, but why are you here? Naruto put his elbow on his knee and placed his chin in the palm of his right hand. I'm your backup. A snort was the response to his glibness. Some backup you are, needing to be rescued. The blonde muttered something unpleasant under his breath that sounded suspiciously like fucking genjutsu. Look, Pain asked me to come here and help you gather intelligence and dwindle down Hanzo's forces so that when he comes, which, by the way, sounds like he'll be doing pretty soon, he won't have to deal with any of the small fries. Pain-sama is finally prepared to liberate Amiga Corps? Apparently. So, if you'd be so kind as to share. Naruto gestured. Haro settled down cross-legged. See that tower over there? He asked, pointing to a structure in the distance that rose just slightly above all the rest. The tallest one? Yeah. That's where Hanzo lives. I assume you had a bit of difficulty sneaking into the village because of all the patrols, right? At Naruto's nod, he continued, well, Hanzo's tower is under the same kind of constant surveillance, only more efficient. Even in Amiga Corps, his paranoia is legendary, he doesn't come out to speak to the citizens, and everyone that goes to see him is checked thoroughly by his guards. Naruto raised an eyebrow. If he's so security conscious and paranoid, how'd you learn all of this? I doubt you were able to just go up to him and ask. The cobalt-haired male smirked. You'd be surprised what you hear on the streets when you actually blend in. Naruto grumbled a little, but didn't say anything. Hanzo's reputation is pretty impressive here in Ame. Not that that condones what he's done. Yeah, Naruto said, waving off his companion's words. It had been enough listening to Haro preach his beliefs back in the Chunin exams, he didn't need a reminder of the cobalt-haired male's zeal for Pain's ideals. He climbed to his feet. Anyway, since you know more about this place than I do, I'm perfectly content to relegate the leadership position to you. So what's our next move? Haro also stood. If Pain-sama is coming soon, then we should figure out all that we can about Hanzo's security by staking out the tower. Maybe we can get a better grasp of what sort of numbers we can expect, or the skills of his guards. Naruto nodded. Sounds good. Time passed slowly when it consisted of squatting in only a couple of places, trying to get a working idea of how the hidden range security operated while not getting caught. After 5 days of little results, Naruto and Haro, sitting in the latter's base, on a break from their routine of watching Hanzo's tower, were accosted by an orange-haired man with a fringe of hair on the right side of his face and the rest held in a high ponytail. The black piercings and ringed, gray eyes were telling, even if the rest of the man's appearance was unusual. Pain? Naruto hazarded. Yes. Haro murmured a polite pain-sama as Naruto gazed at Akatsuki's leader curiously. What? He began, wondering as to his appearance, but then shook his head. You know what? I don't think I care enough. I once told you there were many forms of pain, the older shinobi stated. There are also many forms of pain. Naruto groaned a little at the wordplay, he hated riddles and the like. Where is Hanzo? Pain continued. The tower, Haro replied, pointing. Guards? 4 in his room at all times. More on the floors below. You two will come with me, Pain decided. While I deal with Hanzo, you will prevent any interference from those loyal to him. Cool, Naruto stated, cracking his knuckles as Haro unsheathed Kiba. The two teenagers followed Pain out, and it only took a number of minutes before they were on the building opposite the windowless tower Hanzo housed himself in. So how do we get in? Pain flipped through hand signs and then placed his palm flat upon the roof of their building. The spiky-haired visage of the man Naruto was used to dealing with appeared in a cloud of smoke. Naruto blinked, muttering, right, this makes sense. Perhaps one day you will understand, said the spiky-haired Pain. Now is not that time. He held out both hands so that the palms were facing Hanzo's building. Banshu Tenin, he intoned. There was a loud screeching of metal that lasted several seconds before a massive chunk was ripped from the side of the structure. 2 Ame Nin leapt out of the opening, but Haro crossed his twin katana together and uttered, Raiten, Raiga. Blue bolts of electricity arced out and struck the 2 ranged shinobi squarely in the chest. Naruto was already running through hand signs and inhaling a deep breath of air as the remaining 2 guards appeared in the hole Pain had created. Futon, Shinku Rinpa. Slices of wind at varying angles burst forth from his mouth and entered the tower, making small grooves in the metal as they passed and shedding the blood of the Ame Nin. Hanzo appeared after a moment, stepping over the corpses of his men, his strange eyes reminding Naruto eerily of Kakuzu. You, he stated, looking at the spiky-haired Pain. I had thought you dead. More ninja were rushing up the stairs to stand behind Hanzo as backup. Pain remained unfazed. You thought wrong, he returned, and now your time has come. Some unspoken understanding passed through the leaders of the 2 hidden Rain factions. At the same moment, an instant before they jumped to take their battle deeper into Omega-Core, both men ordered, kill them. Naruto and Haro were suddenly left facing a small force of Hanzo's personal army. Lightning crackled in the sky as Haro manipulated one of the weapons of the legendary 7 shinobi swordsman. Wind swirled in a deadly storm with Naruto at the eye. The 2 boys exchanged wry grins, and then let loose their attacks. Raito Jutsu, Rakurai. Futon, Furyudan no Jutsu. Blood painted the walls of Hanzo's private tower. LLL. Kakuzu resisted the urge to growl as Tobi's body phased through yet another attack, head-on falling through the masked man and getting sliced by the wind from a futon, Atsugai. The thread user would have never guessed upon his inception that, given his personality, Tobi was such an accomplished shinobi, though he supposed that the man had to have some skill to warrant becoming a member of Akatsuki, but the evidence spoke for itself. His mastery of space-time ninjutsu, techniques Kakuzu had written off as all but rumors, barring the summoning technique, was beyond impressive, not to mention aggravating. Konan's brief rundown of the man's abilities had only slightly prepared him for what the reality entailed. He had, rather unfortunately, lost his fire heart to the other shinobi almost immediately after the battle had begun, the thread creature having been sucked into some alternate dimension while the 5S class missing nin had tried to work around each other. That, however, had been the only heart he'd lost thus far after choosing to recall all but the wind heart, which was zipping around out of Tobi's reach, too fast for him to catch. The fight had eventually settled into a sort of cat-and-mouse game between the 5 Akatsuki members and Tobi. An outsider could tell that the quintet was unused to working with each other, though Hidan's and Kakuzu's teamwork was as seamless as usual, as was Itachi's and Kisame's, limited though it had been thus far. The problem, Kakuzu thought, was that while they were all strong in their own right, Tobi wasn't a shinobi who fought with strength, and there wasn't much crossover in abilities in the quintet. S-class Nukenin were, by nature, arrogant and resistant to working together. Still, they had managed to work out a strategy that, while having no success thus far, gave them the best shot of coming out victorious. Hidan, with his preferred method of fighting, was serving as a sort of distraction in a very frontal assault, attempting to lure Toby into an attack. If his scythe ever connected, the battle would essentially be over, but given Toby's phasing abilities, that outcome was a fool's dream at best. The silver-haired man was covered by Kakuzu, and his thread creature, who either lashed out with Jeong's tendrils or expelled bursts of water, wind, or lightning whenever Toby tried to absorb Hidan into what Conan had only been able to describe vaguely as an alternate dimension. In any other situation, the old thread user might have been overjoyed at finding a method to rid himself of Hidan, but given the circumstances, he knew it was better to keep defending his partner, hoping to hit Toby in the moment the masked man was tangible. Conan was hovering in the air with the aid of large paper wings, sharp eyes keeping watch over the battlefield. In contrast to Hidan's pure offense and Kakuzu's mixed offense/defense, the blue-haired woman was serving as backup to anyone Toby tried to sneak up on, sniping at the masked man with paper weapons. Kakuzu found himself grudgingly grateful for her presence, as she'd already protected him and Itachi once each, and Kisame twice. It was difficult to see in the dim light of the cavern beneath Otogakur, where the sealing rituals were normally performed, though the spacious environment and reinforced rock meant that the thread user could let loose with whatever attacks he wanted and not have to worry about bringing down the place. Kisame, the other offensive fighter, had also taken advantage of the large area by using massive Suiten attacks like the exploding water colliding wave and the great waterfall technique to change the terrain to his advantage. At least a foot of liquid covered the entire floor of the cavern. Itachi had so far done very little but observe quietly from a corner, though he had stepped in when he deemed it necessary. The nonagenarian wondered if the Uchiha was waiting for an opening, or if, despite his renowned skill, he just didn't have the massive chakra capacities that he and Kisame boasted. Genjutsu wasn't a particularly chakra-intensive branch of ninja techniques, and Itachi's focus on that art could be explained by a lower-than-average stamina. Thread speared outwards from his back, preventing Toby from grabbing him by forcing him to phase through the attack. As the masked man fell through his torso, Kakuzu returned his mind to the battlefield, deciding that trying to analyze his fellow Nukenin wasn't a good idea when fighting for his life. Not to mention the lives of his pupils. Sharks rose out of the water as Toby landed. They passed through him harmlessly, through both Toby and Kakuzu turned their attention to Kisame, who was kneeling, holding one palm to the liquid covering the floor. The masked shinobi ran towards the blue-skinned man, and the former Taki Nin used his control of water to erect several walls of the hardened substance in Toby's path. While he merely passed through them, Kisame brought Seimata to bear. Kisame sidestepped Toby's grab, bringing the bandaged sword through his torso as he did so. Predictably, the masked shinobi allowed the weapon to phase through him. In the silence as Seimata finished sliding through its target, there was the smallest of ripping sounds. A murder of crows descended upon Toby before he could recover, giving Kisame a chance to move back towards his partner. "Kisame," Itachi intoned. "Hey, got it, Itachi," replied the taller man. Kakuzu pushed down a brief flash of envy at their camaraderie. Why couldn't he have gotten a partner that spoke as little as Itachi and could still manage to convey everything that needed to be said? Better yet, why did he have to have a partner at all? Speaking of which. Oi, where'd that little shit go? Kakuzu glanced back over in the direction of Itachi and Kisame. Sure enough, Toby had disappeared, probably by turning intangible and melding through the floor again. He wondered if the masked shinobi had decided to flee the battle, but decided that if he hadn't done so yet, then he probably wouldn't at all. Toby was oddly confident in his abilities, though given what they were, he probably had a right to be. Even multiple hearts wouldn't save Kakuzu from being sucked into some sort of alternate dimension if Toby managed to lay a lucky hand on him. "Your attacks are remarkably well coordinated," echoed a deep voice from nowhere. Kakuzu realized that the speaker was probably Toby, though the tone was completely at odds with the playful, idiotic disposition the man had displayed throughout his tenure in Akatsuki. It was no wonder Pain wanted to get rid of him, if everything so far had merely been a clever facade. "I admit that this betrayal is quite a surprise. I imagine that Pain put you all up to this task." Kakuzu shot a look Hidan's way, fully expecting the silver-haired man to reply to that. Surprisingly, the Jashinist didn't respond, instead glancing around warily while holding his scythe in a defensive position. Hidan must be taking this task seriously, to not even be uttering the drivel he usually does. That was good, idle hands were more likely to be useless and die. His wind heart was zipping around above his partner's head, ready to defend him, and Conan was tensed in midair with several paper projectiles formed around her. "If any of you are willing to renounce your allegiance, I would be willing to offer you a niche in my new world," Toby's voice resounded. There was silence for a long moment, broken by the man's rhetorical, "No takers? Very well, I suppose it is time to do away with all of you." Toby appeared from the ground before Kakuzu, reaching out a hand and grabbing the taller ninja by the throat. Instead of retaliating, Kakuzu allowed himself to feel the tug of being pulled into another dimension. When it appeared as if his entire torso was going to disappear, his form lost cohesion and turned into water. Kisame took the time his fellow Nukenin had granted him and held out his hands, the heels of his palms held close together, fingers bared like claws. Suten, Daikodan no Jutsu. A monstrous shark made entirely of water was thrust from his hands, its maw open to close over Toby. The masked man activated his phasing ability to allow him to pass through the liquid creature, but part of the way through, it became apparent that he was being carried along by the fish's momentum. Simultaneously, orange-red chakra flared to life around Itachi, encasing him in the form of an ethereal warrior. A blazing yellow sword appeared in one of its right hands, and as Kisame's shark splashed down, the weapon lanced out and pierced Toby's midsection. "You possess the sword of Totsuka?" he gasped. "How?" "Your space-time ninjutsu uses chakra to make your body immaterial," Itachi intoned. "This became apparent when Seimata passed through you, but absorbed enough chakra to make a rip in your cloak at the end. Kisame drained your chakra with his ninjutsu, allowing me to stab your now tangible body with the Totsuka blade. Now you will live in an eternal genjutsu, and your machinations will no longer affect the world." Toby couldn't say anything else as he was drawn into the gourd in the warrior's second right hand. The flames of chakra disappeared from around Itachi, and he subtly wiped a trail of blood away from his eye. "He will be of no concern any longer," he informed the others, watching Kakuzu rise from the water covering the floor. "I will inform Pain that our mission has been accomplished," Konan stated, withdrawing her wings and moving towards the exit. Hidan made a noise of disappointment, kicking at the water around his feet. Not even a fucking body to sacrifice to Jashin-sama. Kakuzu rolled his eyes as his wind heart returned to him. He picked up his cloak, which he had tossed aside at the beginning of the battle, and wrung the water from it, throwing it over his shoulder. "Come, Hidan," he beckoned, following Konan out. "I feel rather charitable. Perhaps you can find enough sacrifices to appease your god at the Konoha outpost we will visit. I need a new fire heart, anyway." "Ha! I knew you'd come around eventually, Kakuzu, you old bastard." The thread user waited for Hidan to go ahead of him before addressing Itachi and Kisame. "Your help in this matter was greatly appreciated." He wouldn't admit that without the chakra-absorbing properties of Kisame's technique, or the sealing ability of Itachi's, he, Hidan, and Konan would have been unlikely to actually beat Toby by themselves. Hey, Fishbait's an interesting kid. I'd be interested in seeing how far he's come since our last fight. Itachi merely nodded at Kakuzu before adding, "His life is his own now." How very true, Kakuzu thought, leaving the pair behind. LLL. Pain returned to the tower that Hanzo had formerly inhabited through the hole he had blown in the side, using the Deva Path as his representative once again. Naruto and Hero stood stiffly at attention, and if either one was interested in commenting on the fact that Pain was back to using the spiky-haired body, neither mentioned it. "Omega-Cure is free," he announced. "Congratulations, Pain-sama," Hero murmured, bowing slightly. The orange-haired man inclined his head in acknowledgement of his subordinate. "There are still things to be taken care of, but there are some other matters which require attending first." Ringed eyes fixed Naruto with an unwavering gaze. "Zetsu found your associate crossing the land of earth border into the land of stone. I would like you to bring her here. She will be more receptive to your presence than his." Naruto didn't doubt that. "Sure thing." He left as Pain's attention swiveled to Hero, discussing what needed to be done while they awaited his return, which included cleaning the Tower of the Blood and corpses of Hanzo's followers. Its proximity to the Land of Rain and small size meant that it took only a half day to actually get to the Land of Stone and begin searching for Fu. Naruto summoned a couple of chameleons to hasten the process along, sending them out in different directions with the order to find his fellow Jinchuriki, but to return to the Yameishi border in 2 days regardless of what they found. The blonde was disappointed when he didn't find her, but upon rendezvousing with his summons, found Fu in the company of Kamikoso. "Hey," he called, lifting a hand in greeting as the reptiles dismissed themselves. A smile lit upon his features of its own accord. Fu returned the gesture with a tentative curve of her own lips. "Hey." There was a moment of silence as the two just stared at each other, the memory of the last time they were together surfacing in their minds. "You wanted to see me?" Naruto blinked, the spell broken. "Oh, yeah. Pain wants to see us. We've got to get back to Omega-Cure." isn't that bad? The blonde paused for a moment before a snort of laughter escaped him. Oh, right, you didn't hear. He's not gonna take the bijou, he found a way to achieve his plans without killing us. Fu remained skeptical. How do you know he's telling the truth? I don't, Naruto shrugged, but the only reason I found you is because Zetsu found you first, so I think if he wanted to capture us, he could have done it already. That was a pretty fair point, Fu considered, continuing to stare at her friend. Naruto was simply standing there, waiting for her to come to a decision, and though she felt a little bad for her apprehension, she knew that this choice was the equivalent of walking into a lion's den covered in meat. The blonde peered at her, a solemn look in his blue eyes. Don't you trust me? Fu sighed to herself, it really wasn't fair that he could do that. Of course I do. The return trip to Omegakure was filled with conversation of the adventures each Jinchuriki had undergone since their split. Neither wanted to dwell on the idea that Pain would betray them, or what was potentially between them when the future wasn't yet set in stone. Pain and Harrow were waiting for them when Naruto led Fu to the tower that Hanzo had kept himself isolated in. The massive hole was still there, and Naruto couldn't resist commenting, "You clearly haven't redecorated yet." Neither of the gray-eyed males offered a response, though the blonde thought that he saw Harrow roll his eyes. Pain turned around and walked towards the back of the room, where the steel walls of the tower were untouched. There have been higher priorities, he mentioned. Come. The two Jinchuriki exchanged glances before moving forward and coming to a stop just behind Akatsuki's leader. If you would like to complete your quest for vengeance against Konohagakure, I require your assistance. With what? Pain glanced at Naruto. The jutsu I have crafted utilizes the chakra of the bijou to create mass destruction. Unfortunately, while controllable with only some of them, it becomes more potent in direct proportion to the amount of bijou being used to power it. Therefore, I would ask you to sacrifice some of the chakra of your bijou to help facilitate Konohagakure's destruction. I also believe it would be more satisfying for you to personally contribute to the annihilation of the village which has caused you so much grief, he added, catching Naruto's gaze. And how would you do this? The orange-haired man reached into the opposite sleeve of his cloak and withdrew a foot-long black rod with a metallic sheen. These are capable of siphoning the chakra of your bijou and transmitting it into the ceiling statue. It is a way to feed the statue the required chakra without a complete extraction. The two Jinchuriki exchanged glances again. Okay, Naruto assented, we'll do it. Pain nodded and motioned for them to position themselves with their backs to the wall. Harrow, curious, came forward to stand beside his leader. I will warn you that you will feel an excruciating pain unlike any you have felt before, Pain intoned. I think we can handle you putting those in our bodies, right? Naruto asked Fu. The older girl merely nodded. Pain stared at him for a moment, the tip of the first black rod poised over the boy's abdomen, where the seal holding the Kyuubi at bay was located. That was not what I was referring to. He slid the rod into Naruto's skin with ease, like a hot knife through butter, and to the blonde's credit, he only winced slightly at the sensation. More rods were carefully inserted into his upper and lower arms, as well as his thighs and calves. The same process was repeated with Fu. He took a single step backwards and peered at the girl before uttering, "Ah," as if struck by realization. Taking a step forward, he untied the slashed waterfall hit he ate from her right bicep, wrapped the cloth around the metal, and then commanded, "Open." She did as he bid, and Pain slipped the forehead protector into her mouth. She bit down on it reflexively. He approached Naruto and went through the same motions. A precaution, he assured them. To Harrow, he said, "Watch them. Make sure the ritual remains uninterrupted." The cobalt-haired boy nodded, and then Pain left. Minutes passed, forcing Naruto to wonder when Pain would begin activating whatever technique it was that he had come up with and why he had to leave to do so. Fu's muffled screaming cut off his train of thought. His own body began to heat up, as if fire filled his veins instead of blood. The Kyuubi's chakra, as much a part of him as his own chakra, blood, organs, and flesh because of the seal, was slowly being sucked out of his body. Were he capable of forming a cohesive thought, he would have been forced to admit that Pain had been right. It was the most excruciating agony he had ever been forced to endure, even surpassing the pain Jung had caused him. Across the hidden rain, the sound of two Jinchuriki having a part of their very being pulled from their bodies echoed in the ears of the newly freed citizens. LLL. Danzo was in a rather foul mood, though he refused to let it show outwardly. Tenzo had missed his last two scheduled check-ins, a feat that was unheard of in the man's Onbu career. It could only mean one thing. He was dead. It was a horrible, frustrating conclusion to come to, given Tenzo's skill and special abilities. The loss of Hyuga Neji some time before that had been regrettable, though not as lamentable as the loss of the wood user. Now, Danzo's one surefire tool to overcoming the Jinchuriki of the other hidden villages, the few that remained, anyway, given what limited information he had received on Akatsuki's movements, was gone, and without even the recaptured Kyubi Jinchuriki as compensation. Kenzo's death and the Kyubi Jinchuriki's freedom didn't bode well for either Danzo or Konoha. The boy was clearly strong enough to defeat an elite Onbu, apparently without even having to draw on the Kyubi's chakra, given that suppression of the Bijou would have significantly weakened him. For the boy to have left Konoha and never returned spoke of either severe distrust or dislike of the village hidden in leaves. Danzo would have to begin drafting some more secure defensive measures than those already in place in order to prepare for whatever might come. A massive pulse of chakra disrupted his thoughts, right before the windows of the Hokage's office exploded in a shower of glass. Danzo managed to replace himself with a chair on the opposite side of his desk, using the wooden construct as a shield to protect himself from the shards. One of his root agents leapt down from the ceiling and knelt beside him. "Danzo-sama, are you injured?" "No, but I want to know what that was." He stood up and looked outside the broken windows, and the sight before him caused his one visible eye to widen considerably. An enormous bipedal, wooden-looking statue was rampaging through Konoha, though that appeared to be the least of the village's problems. Bijou, Danzo didn't know exactly how many, though he could see at least 5 different creatures, were wreaking havoc upon the hidden leaf, chains of golden chakra linked around their necks and leading to the strange statue. As he watched, a head of red fur spewed lava over the Konoha hospital while a bluish-white head expelled a wave of greenish-tinged liquid at the academy building. It was dissolved within seconds. Danzo jumped from the Hokage tower just as a burst of wind struck it, vaporizing the upper levels instantly. The aged man looked up to find a gigantic blue and green beetle with 6 wings and a whip-like 7th tail hovering overhead. Unlike the other Bijou he could see, this one seemed to be composed more of chakra than an actual, physical form, though he had little time to ponder on the difference before he was forced to move. Konoha was a loss, he realized. Given his lifelong goal to unite all the shinobi in the world under Konoha's control, the thought was a rather depressing one. With Tenzo, it might have been possible to restrain a handful of the Bijou and maybe contain them, but without him, the likelihood of Konoha's forces being able to scrape together and fight off what appeared to be the entire armada of tailed beasts was practically zero. The Kyubi's attack a little over 17 years ago had only been halted because of the Yondaime Hokage, and while Danzo was a more than capable Fuinjutsu specialist, crafting so many seals within such a short time span while evading the Bijou and expecting to survive beyond the first one was impossible. His best option was to retreat and regroup his forces after Akatsuki, and he could safely assume that this was Akatsuki's doing, finished its business. He began to undo the bolts on the braces of his suppressor seals, knowing that he would need to use Izanagi to even retain some hope of escaping. The process was cut short by an orange-red paw of pure chakra, and Danzo looked up to find the visage of the Kyubi staring down at him. Chakra arms rose from the ground and caught the elderly man, and Danzo was forced to sacrifice Shisui's eye to escape and run away. The chakra form of the Kyubi pursued, and after a brief chase that prevented him from undoing the braces on his arm, Shimura Danzo, Ga-Daime Hokage of Konohagakure, was no more. Clouded over in death, his visible eye was blind to the sight of the remaining 8 Bijou crafting black spheres of pure chakra and launching them at the village he had tried so hard to protect, razing it to the ground. LLL. Pain returned to the inner sanctum of Amigakure's tallest tower to find Hero watching over the forms of Naruto and Fu. The cobalt-haired boy bowed respectfully to his leader, though his face held a healthy amount of concern for his companions. Pain-sama. Yes, I know. Ringed, gray eyes observed the 2 Jinchuriki passively. Both were pale and sweating profusely, inhaling air through their noses in short, ragged bursts. Heads of blonde and mint green were hung in exhaustion, and as he watched, the forehead protectors that had been placed in their mouths fell to the floor. Saliva dripped slowly from the mouths of Kakuzu's 2 pupils. "Your resilience is most impressive." "Ha, yeah," rasped Naruto without ever looking up. He chuckled weakly, but his amusement quickly broke off into a long series of hacking coughs. Beside him, Fu only groaned. "Your sacrifice was most appreciated," Pain informed them. He asked Hero to fetch some food and water before approaching the wall the 2 Jinchuriki were pinned to. Black rods were pulled out of flesh and dropped to the floor with a clatter. Both teenagers followed when all the rods had been removed, landing gracelessly on hands and knees. Fu allowed her entire body to slide into a boneless heap, laying belly down on the cool metal. Naruto tried to lift himself up, but moaned at the effort and instead flopped onto his back, eyes closed. Hero returned with a bowl of water, some ration bars, and a second bowl of fruit, all of which were set before the two Jinchuriki. Because of your cooperation, I have finally achieved a goal 3 decades in the making. Konoha? Naruto panted, twitching his fingers in search of food. Haro unwrapped a ration bar and put it in his hand. Reduced to rubble. Naruto allowed a tired smile to grace his features. His original goal had been to enact his own form of revenge against Konoha by killing its shinobi, and then, well, he honestly hadn't planned that far. Konoha had a rather large population, and one man diminishing its forces a couple of people at a time would take a long while to actually hurt the hidden village. But this solution, well, though he hadn't directly destroyed the hidden leaf, he had still played a large and intricate part in its downfall. That didn't even include all of the Konoha nin he'd killed over the years as part of his initial plan. He suddenly felt satisfied. Lighter. For years, he had resented the citizens of the Leaf for how unfairly he'd been treated in his youth, and now that his vengeance was complete, the burden he had placed on himself to actually do something was lifted. Though, he acknowledged with a wince, there was something to be said for how painful the mechanism to do so had been. Pain's voice caught his attention. We are not yet done. We're not? Fu mumbled. She sounded like she wanted to do nothing more than take a very long nap. No, reasserted the orange-haired man, the destruction of Konoha was only the first phase of my plan. Naruto opened tired blue eyes and gazed at Pain's upside-down form. Akatsuki's leader was staring down at the pair of Jinchuriki placidly. The second phase involves making sure that the world embraces peace. Naruto licked his lips, and Haro tipped some water from the bowl into his mouth before moving over to Fu and doing the same thing. The blonde wondered absently whether his cobalt-haired companion resented being asked to act as a nursemaid. Then again, in his own silent way, Haro seemed inordinately pleased about the recent turn of events. Perhaps he was too happy that his leader had finally managed to free their home nation from the rule of a paranoid tyrant to really question any new tasks, temporarily, assigned to him. Naruto gave his head a slow shake to return to the matter at hand. And how do we do that? His tongue still felt thick from screaming, but the water had given his parched throat enough relief to eke out more than one word at a time. We give the remaining Kijis a reason to fear us. I would like for you two to accompany me. The Kyuubi Jinchuriki blinked. We're not exactly in any condition to travel. Agreed, Fu added. Haro tipped some more water into her mouth, and she murmured, thanks. You will recover soon enough, Pain assured them, and your presence will make a greater and better received impact than if I brought other members of Akatsuki with me. Naruto rolled over and then, fighting against every instinct that urged him to remain in his current position, slowly maneuvered himself into a seated position. He grabbed an apple from the bowl Haro had brought, took a massive bite, and began to chew. Though it was phrased oddly, Pain was actually asking if he and Fu would be the ones to continue to see his plans through to the end. Blue eyes met gray. Give us a day. LLL. Mifune, samurai and general of the Land of Iron, surveyed the incomplete semicircle of leaders arrayed before him. To his right was the Yondaime Reikage, a dark-skinned, muscled man with white blonde hair, a pointed beard, and a tiny mustache. He was cloaked in the white robes of his position, though they were left open in the front to reveal his prominent abdominals. Large, golden bracers decorated his wrists, and by the way his fingers beat a staccato rhythm on the tabletop, as well as the scowl on his features, Mifune could tell that he was impatient for the meeting to begin. The man's two subordinates, a dark-skinned man with white hair and a bored expression, and a pale-skinned platinum blonde, flanked him on either side. The Sandaime Tsuchikage, renowned as Ryotenbin no Aniki, was to the Reikage's right, his small stature seeming even smaller next to the hulking giant of both his own bodyguard, a chubby man with a yellow scarf around his neck, and the Reikage. He was mostly bald, but retained a topknot of snow-white hair, matched only by his thick eyebrows, a handlebar mustache with pointed ends, and a triangular beard only slightly longer than the Reikage's. His expression was one of irritated grouchiness, a stark contrast to the semi-amused smirk his other bodyguard, a short, dark-haired woman with pupilless pink eyes, wore. On Mifune's left sat the Godime Mizukage, Terumi Mei. Her long, auburn hair was styled in a herringbone pattern, accented by a short topknot and two sets of bangs, one which framed her face and covered her right eye, the other which draped down her collarbone and drew attention to her ample bosom. She was clad in a blue dress that hugged her upper body, with fishnet sewn into the hems. From his angle, Mifune could see that there was a long slit in her dress, revealing fishnet-clad legs. Facial expression as indifferent as the Reikage's white-haired bodyguard, her own accompaniment, a slight boy with misty blue hair and rectangular glasses, and an older man with slightly darker blue hair arranged in a spike and a patch over his right eye, looked nervous and serious, respectively. Next to her was the god Kazekage, a brown-eyed, bored-looking woman that Mifune only knew by reputation, Pakura of the Scorch Release. Her dark green hair was styled in a bun held together by a single senbone, 2 orange strands framing her face. She wore a dark, sleeveless top and lavender arm warmers that went almost all the way to her shoulders. Both of her guards, a stern-looking man with cloth covering the left side of his face, and a younger woman with purple facial markings reminiscent of the Inuzuka clan and a cloth heading covering, appeared as bored as their leader. Mifune wondered how much of their collective apathy was a ruse, given the event that had facilitated the meeting. He hadn't been in charge of the last Cage Summit as he hadn't been the leader of the Land of Iron way back when it had taken place, at the end of the Third Shinobi World War. The purpose of the meeting was clear: the empty chair of the Hokage, between the Tsuchikage and Kazekage, giving the room a stark separation. Mifune stood to gather the attention of the collective shinobi. "I believe it is evident why this gathering has been called," he announced. "The recent destruction of Konohagakure, one of the 5 great shinobi nations, is a worrisome event." "It's the damned Akatsuki," roared the Raikage, rising to his feet and slamming a fist upon the table. Both of his bodyguards tried not to flinch as the all-too-familiar sound of splintering would reach their ears. "If the rest of you had heeded my summons when Kirabai had been captured, this could have been prevented." "Humph," snorted Aniki, "you're the one who has always preached about countries being able to survive on their own power. If you couldn't keep your Jinchuriki safe, what concern was it of ours?" Mei nodded in agreement. "You are not the only one who lost your weapons, Raikage Dono, but none of the rest of us felt it necessary to gather all of the Kages together. That," spoke a new voice, "is because the rest of you have been using our services instead of your Jinchuriki to augment your power." Mifune had to turn around as all the Kage's bodyguards took up defensive positions around their leaders. Standing before him was a man possessing multiple facial piercings, with spiky orange hair and ringed, gray eyes, though his most prominent feature was the telltale black cloak with red clouds that symbolized a member of Akatsuki. Flanking him were 2 shinobi no older than teenagers, one a spiky-haired blonde male, the other a shorter female with mint green hair and pupilless orange eyes. There was a slight gasp from the Iwagakure shinobi, but Mifune paid it no mind. "Akatsuki," bellowed he. "I'll have your head for what you did to my brother." He blurred forward faster than Mifune could track, fully intent on killing the other shinobi. The orange-haired man was apparently ready for such an assault, as not a second passed before the Raikage was sent hurtling backwards, breaking off the back of his chair in the process. "I have not come here looking to start a fight," intoned the man, "though I would be willing to oblige if you insist. However, I must warn you that, as a god, you mere mortals, Kages you may be, do not stand a chance against me." Mifune spied the Raikage's bodyguards helping the dark-skinned man to his feet from the corner of his eye. Returning his full attention to the man before him, he asked, "Then why are you here?" "My name is Pain, and as you might have inferred, I am Akatsuki's leader. I have come here as a diplomat, to have my peace heard by all of you. I have even abided by the 2 bodyguard rule." Ringed, gray eyes explored the room. "If I had any interest in killing you, rest assured I would have brought the entirety of my forces." "Very well," Mifune granted at length, "we will hear what you have to say." "You can't be serious." The Raikage roared, his mustache bristling. "This man is responsible for the destruction of Konohagakure," Pain interjected seamlessly, "which was merely a demonstration of my power. Perhaps Kamagakure would like another look." "He is here as the rest of you are," Mifune stated, "as a neutral party. If he truly desired our demise, I am sure his entrance would not have been so obvious. He could have merely attacked this summit in the same method as he did Konohagakure. Given that he did not, he trailed off, letting the gathered shinobi draw their own conclusions. Your fellow Kages have managed to restrain their outbursts despite their unease. Please sit down, Raikage Dono." He did as he was bid after a long moment of glaring, his abhorrence clear on his face. "Would you like a seat, Pain?" The lack of an honorific, and thus, respect, wasn't lost on anyone present. "No, I shall remain standing. I trust the gathered parties as much as they trust me." Mifune nodded and returned his gaze so he was staring once more at the 4 Kages. "Why are you here?" Mei asked frostily. "Despite many of your villages using Akatsuki for your own purposes in the past," Pain began, "you lack understanding of what our goal is. We are not a mercenary group for hire, nor are we a method to bolster your forces during war. We are the solution to war, a method to create peace." Aniki snorted again. "Your way of spreading peace is certainly backwards. You've destroyed one of the 5 great shinobi nations." "Konohagakure received what it deserved," Pain returned, a tinge of coldness in his voice. It has started and been embroiled in the most wars, and has wreaked more destruction than necessary. Do not pretend to be sorrowed by its destruction. Tsuchikage, Kana Hagakure inflicted grievous injuries upon your forces in the Third Shinobi World War. Sunagakure also benefits from its disappearance. Reparations have been costly, have they not, Kazekage? Not having to live under the thumb of Konoha relieves my village of a great burden, Pakura stated calmly, speaking for the first time since her contingent's arrival. Additionally, Akatsuki's removal of Shukaku from our possession has allowed my people to live in less fear of being killed by one of its own. You sound like you condone Akatsuki's actions, Kazekage Dono, Mei said. The actions of the previous Kazekage left Suna in shambles, Pakura replied, her tone bland. We have been neither as prosperous nor as strong as we were during the days of the Sandaime Kazekage. If Akatsuki has a solution to this issue that betters life for my people, I am open to suggestions. You propose listening to this lunatic? Spat. You will all listen to me, Pain said, raising his voice slightly. While Kana Hagakure had the most infractions against it, all of your villages have ravaged the land with your war. I will not tolerate such action to continue now that I have the power to stop it. All of your bijou, your weapons, are within my possession, and I have no compunctions about using them against you if my requests are not met. And what are your requests? Mifune asked. Amigakure will take Kana Hagakure's place as the fifth of the 5 great shinobi nations. It will be a place of refuge for anyone willing to comply with its rules. In addition, there will be no more war. The world will be a better place with peace ruling, people need not experience pain ever again. Your proposal all but disintegrates the need for a shinobi system, Mei said. Pain turned his gaze to her. Perhaps, though I have little doubt that there are other ways to make shinobi useful. Nukenin from your villages still roam the world, do they not? Without focusing on methods to usurp the powers of the other villages, you can devote more energy into tracking down these threats to peace. In addition, shinobi have prowess which normal civilians do not, they could offer their services for the betterment of your village. Anaki squinted at the orange-haired man. And if we refuse to comply with your demands? Gray eyes focused on him. Then your village will be destroyed, Pain responded flatly. Kana Hagakure is now rubble, I can do the same to any of your villages. In addition, Akatsuki is comprised of Nukenin from most of your homes, Datara, Akasuna no Sasori, Hoshigaki Kisame, he stated, turning from the Tsuchikage to the Kazekage and Mizukage in turn. They are just a couple of the members within my employ, and I can learn all the secrets of your villages that they know. Anaki's hands gravitated towards each other, a spark of his legendary Kekkei Tota forming between them at the implied threat. Lightning flashed around the rakeage, and the area around the Mizukage began to become distorted with heat. If that still does not appease you. Fu stepped forward, the beginning of her own Jinten technique appearing in her palms. Naruto was right beside her, a nimbus of glowing energy encircling his clasped hands. You should be aware that the last surviving Jinchuriki work for me, Pain finished. Much of the fight seemed to go out of the room at that announcement, Anaki's dust release dissipating into nothing. She can use Jinten? He gaped. Beside him, the Rakeage was exchanging heated words with his dark-skinned guard. Pain placed a hand on each of his subordinates' shoulders, silently telling them to relax. Both released their prepared techniques. The Nanabi no Kabutamushi is the originator of your vaunted Kekkei Tota, he stated, and the skills of the Kyubi Jinchuriki are even more impressive. He almost added you can test them if you'd like, but opted to let the fact that 2 Jinchuriki were allied with him speak for itself. Mei fixed the pair with a hard stare. You would work for this man, knowing what he has done? Yes, Fu responded without hesitation. His goal is a noble one, and he's offered us a place in his new world. I can offer you more. Naruto laughed, though the sound was far darker than it should be coming from someone so young. Yeah, sure, he replied cynically. The Sanbi, formerly sealed within your Yondaime Mizukage, was found in the wild because you had the Jinchuriki killed when it was discovered he had been manipulated by a genjutsu. The Mizukage looked momentarily surprised that he had such knowledge, but quickly schooled her features. Naruto was suddenly grateful he had gleaned some interesting tidbits of information from Pain, who had received his own information from the other members of Akatsuki, about the status of his fellow containers before they had been captured. And the Rakubi Jinchuriki had been declared a Nukenin from your village for who knows how long. The blonde turned steely blue eyes upon Pakura. Your Jinchuriki was a certifiable head case who believed killing people was needed to prove his existence. A slight shiver ran through Fu at the memory of Gaara, causing Naruto to scowl. He turned to Anaki. You sent a measly 8 shinobi to try and track down your Jinchuriki, who had been all but exiled from your village and was living in the mountains. I know because I killed them. And your other Jinchuriki, well, from what I heard, you didn't even bother going after him, and he was the first one Akatsuki kidnapped. He stated, thumbing towards Fu, and I were mistreated and spurned for things we never had any control over in our villages. Once we were free to do as we wanted, we could finally live our lives the way we wanted, and Pain offered us the opportunity to create a world where such inequality wouldn't exist. And you think that we're stupid enough to ally ourselves with one of your villages? Don't make me laugh, he scoffed. Kumo treated its Jinchuriki fairly. The Raikage barked. Yeah, the blonde drawled dryly, his tone rife with cynical disbelief, you apparently seem to be the exception rather than the rule on many accounts. We're not joining you either, though. You may try to sway them to your side, but your village's treatment of Jinchuriki is common knowledge, Pain intoned. Your breath is wasted. You have two options, submit to my demands, or resist, and perish. Silence reigned in the small building as the assembled Kijis and their bodyguards weighed their options. He still looked enraged, and beside him, Anaki had a troubled expression on his face, trying to come to terms with the knowledge that, not only was there another living person who could wield Jinten, but that a teenager who looked remarkably like the Yellow Flash, Iwa's Bane, was standing before him. Mei still appeared coolly indifferent, though the heat emanating off her belied her true feelings. I accept Pain's terms. All eyes shifted to look at Pakura, whose face was placid. You mean to side with these cutthroats and anarchists? Roared the Raikage. What you perceive as anarchy is merely a clash of our ideals with yours, Pain interrupted. Your wars have ravaged my home. Pakura held up a held, and Pain, curious to hear what she would say, inclined his head in a modicum of respect. The green and orange-haired woman turned her gaze to the Raikage. You are too blinded by the loss of your brother to see the big picture. For one thing, Akatsuki, which until now has been thought to be comprised of mercenaries, has rather unnecessarily followed the rules of the Cage Summit in an attempt to fill in the vacuum left by Konoha's destruction. In a world where this man, she gestured towards Pain, controls the most powerful forces we are aware of, such an action is not indicative of someone bent on world domination. Kumo has also not experienced what it is like to deal with a Jinchuriki who is hated and feared by its village in many years. To have swayed two Jinchuriki bearing such pasts to his side, Pain must have some measure of charisma that they respect. In his quest to create peace for the world, he has removed the concept of Jinchuriki from the nation's possession, thus creating a more equal balance of power among the remaining countries. This will exclude Ame, but given that it already controls the remaining Bijou, having two active Jinchuriki will make no difference. Perhaps when the Jinchuriki pass on, the Bijou they possess will be sealed in the same fashion as the rest? She posed. Pain inclined his head once more in assent, if only to offer some reassurance to the woman. Pakura continued on, given that Pain has already reduced Konoha to nothing, he has the power to destroy anything he deems appropriate. As he is proposing a solution which does not use such a devastating methodology, it would be foolish to go against it. I do not necessarily agree with how he went about instigating his idealism, but he has achieved something that the world has yet to see, assuming the rest of you choose to do the intelligent thing and submit. With Konoha no longer restraining our growth, Suna can once again become strong. We appreciate this opportunity, she directed at Pain. You will see no trouble from us. Pain nodded at her before passing his gaze around to the other Kijis. One by one, the rest of them acquiesced to his demands, though only Pakura's expression remained free of any sourness or hatred. I will take my leave now, he intoned. Know that I have no interest in the Land of Fire, and you may divide up the land as you like, peaceably. I will be watching for any breach of our contract. With that, he turned and swept out of the building, Naruto and Fu on his heels. They walked through the dozens of fallen samurai, all knocked unconscious on the trio's way into the Cage Summit. They actually caved into your demands. So, now what, Amikage-sama? Naruto asked, a teasing note in his voice. The Kijis are not so easily persuaded, Pain informed him. The Kazekage's intentions seem sincere, but I do not trust the rest of them to retain the same goodwill. While Amiga Corps becomes strong, Akatsuki will keep an eye on them from the shadows. And if they step out of line? Fu posed. Then they will regret doing so. The trio continued on their way in silence. Naruto couldn't believe the position he was in. Over a decade ago, when Kakuzu had stolen him out of the Land of Fire and began the tedious process of imparting his knowledge onto the blonde, he would have never expected this to be the outcome. Now, with his vengeance against Konoha complete and the world forced to bow to Akatsuki's will, he wasn't sure quite what to do next. He shot a furtive glance at Fu, suddenly quite aware of the fact that they now had their whole lives ahead of them and the unresolved feelings of a kiss they had shared to discuss. I wonder how things'll change. Chapter 21, Epilogue, Legacy 13 years later. Uzumaki Naruto, Nidaime Amikage, sat at his desk in the tower which had once belonged to Hanzo the Salamander. Blue eyes skimmed the report held in his hand, a message about Kumagakura's most recent attempt at amassing an army. He crumpled the paper in one hand and tossed it over his shoulder with a resigned sigh. You shouldn't just trash everything after you're finished reading it. Naruto spared a glance at Haro, standing beside his desk with the twin katana kiba lashed to their usual place on his back. He graced his cobalt-haired friend with a wry twitch of his lips. Why bother? You know that I only receive copies, and it's not like much ever changes. Eventually, someone will have to go out and scare them back into submission. Honestly, I don't even know why you continue to tell me to save these things. Because it's my job, Haro replied, and because I believe it's important for you to carry on the legacy that Pain-sama began. Naruto swiveled in his chair and faced the window that had eventually filled the hole Pain had created in the building. Rain pattered a steady beat against it, and the blonde was reminded of exactly what had happened following Pain's ultimatum at the Cage Summit. Pain's prediction about the positions of the Kages had been accurate. Naruto, Fu, and the rest of Akatsuki had been deployed on missions to spy on and interfere with the plans of the major hidden villages. The minor ones such as Hidden Frost and Hidden Grass had been approached by some of the more diplomatic members, such as Konan, or been influenced by one of Sasori's spies to accept unconditional surrender to Akatsuki, to ascertain that they would abide by Pain's wishes. Pain had explained that, while possible to simply impose his will upon the other nations via his kinjutsu, it was preferable to simply have the existing Kages bend to his demands by more subtle methods, such as guerrilla subterfuge. Naruto and Fu were rather grateful for such a decision, as they had little desire to once again experience the excruciating torture the kinjutsu had inflicted upon their bodies. Though the reaction had been subtle, Naruto thought that Pain had been a little surprised at Akatsuki's agreement to continue with his plans, though each member had done so based on personal reasons. Deidara had been excited at the prospect of being able to cause more destruction via his art, and Sasori had followed in an effort to add to his puppet collection. Kakuzu had stipulated that he would get all money he acquired from whatever bounties he killed, which Pain had no issues with, and Hidan had tagged along because traveling with the taller shinobi tended to provide him with more sacrifices for Jashin. Itachi hadn't offered an explanation, merely stating that he and Kisame would watch over Kirigakura's movements. Zetsu had simply wanted to cause mischief and try new foods. Out of all the hidden villages, only Sunagakure hadn't needed any sort of continuous overseeing, the Kazekage abiding by her decision to support Pain. In fact, not long after the Cage Summit, the Kazekage had requested the assistance of Akatsuki in quelling a small rebellion within the Hidden Sand. Some of the people hadn't been overly happy with her decision to kowtow to Pain's demands, and she had explained that having Akatsuki come in to quash the uprising would more effectively convey her position than potentially starting a civil war within the village by doing it herself would. Naruto and Fu, both dressed in the black cloak with red clouds of Akatsuki, and how strange it felt to be wearing that uniform, had been deployed. Hidan was too violent, Sasori still retained a grudge against Sunagakure, and Kisame and Itachi were too far away to handle the matter. They had done so easily enough, and to the surprise of both Jinchuriki, the Kazekage had, privately, thanked them afterwards for their assistance and then told them to reassure Pain of her adherence to his demands. Following that, the two Jinchuriki often left on different bounty hunting expeditions meant to deprive the remaining villages of valuable shinobi, thus lowering their ability to resist Pain's stipulations. They returned to Amigakure frequently to report back to Pain and find out the status of the ninja world, and after having 2 years to settle into a routine, Naruto's presence was requested by the orange-haired man. The blonde made his way through Amigakure to Pain's tower, having been enjoying a brief rest at the house he and Fu shared, courtesy of the orange-haired man himself. The pair of Jinchuriki had been dating, though the term had a very loose definition for shinobi, since shortly after Pain had exerted his control over the Hidden Rain, and although the relationship had been strange in the beginning, it had settled into something comfortable that Naruto enjoyed being a part of. His thoughts were derailed when Konan greeted him in Pain's place. She beckoned for him to follow her, and he did so silently, wondering as to the peculiarity when the blue-haired woman led him to the building next door. They climbed up to the top floor, where Konan moved aside and allowed him entrance to a room he'd never seen before. The door slid shut behind her, and in the dim lighting, Naruto could barely make out the distinct forms of what appeared to be 6 pods. "What is this place?" he wondered. "My sanctuary," came the reply, the voice sounding strangely tired. Naruto squinted into the darkness, but a light flickered on above him to reveal an emaciated man strapped to a strange machine, limp red hair hanging about his face. "Welcome, Uzumaki Naruto." The Jinchuriki slowly walked through the room, glancing into the pods as he passed. Each one was occupied by a black-clad figure with orange hair in varying styles, multiple facial piercings, and the strange eyes Pain possessed. He vaguely recognized the body which had met with him and Harrow to fight Hanzo, as well as the spiky-haired form of the man he had come to associate with Akatsuki's leader. Konan passed him and came to stand beside the red-haired man. This place, that body. His eyes darted to look at the spiky-haired form before returning to the figure before him. You're the real Pain? You could say that. Pain is merely an alias with which to spread my ideals. I am Nagato, and I have been leading Akatsuki since before you were born. Nagato's speech was slow and methodical, and combined with his poor physical condition, Naruto wondered how old he really was. Well, I guess I should thank you, then. You know, for not killing Fu and me. Your gratitude is unnecessary, given your continued loyalties. I believe it is I who should thank you for your dedication to my vision. He was interrupted by a fit of violent coughing, and the blonde could see a trickle of blood dribbling from his lips. Naruto almost asked if the older man was okay, but the answer to that question seemed obvious. Konan also appeared visibly concerned, which was a change, given her usual stoic demeanor, standing a little closer than necessary to Nagato and sparing him a worried glance. Instead, the Jinchuriki waited until Nagato appeared settled before voicing the question on his mind. If I might ask, why did you call me here? Nagato nodded slowly. Yes, to business. I am not long for this world. The consequences of using the Geto Mazo have reduced my body to the sight you see before you. As such, the title of Amicage needs to be passed on in order to maintain the balance of power amongst the nations. I am appointing you as my successor. There was silence in the room as both Akatsuki members stared at Naruto, who appeared to be processing Nagato's words. He blinked. What? Then he blinked again, and the message seemed to penetrate the haze pervading his mind. What? You will become the Nidaime Amicage, Nagato reiterated. But, I don't know anything about being a Kage, protested Naruto. I'm a hunter, not a ruler, I'm not even 20 yet. Why me? Why not, Konan? He floundered, pointing at the blue-haired woman. Konan has decided to oversee the populace of Otogakur, which will remain allied with Amigakur, Nagato replied. She doesn't feel she has the constitution to remain here in a position of power. Truthfully, Konan had confided that she didn't think remaining in control of the country her two closest friends had grown up in and died for was something she could handle, and that passing the torch on to Naruto and supporting him from a distance was the best idea. The redhead continued, in addition, when my absence is discovered by the other Kages, Konan's reputation, even as a member of Akatsuki, will not prevent them from rebelling against Amigakur even harder than now. You, as the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, possess such a reputation. You also believe in the ideals of myself and my friend. Nagato's eyes flickered over to the spiky-haired body's pod, and Naruto wondered if that Pain was Yahiko, making you a prime candidate to uphold the beliefs we have strived so hard to achieve. Your strength and your charisma will continue to keep the people of Amigakur free from strife and war. What about the Bijou? Nagato shook his head. You will be unable to utilize the Bijou Kinjutsu that was employed to destroy Konohagakure. I will speak to the other members of Akatsuki about their role in the future, but I would not assume their cooperation upon my demise. You will have to stand on your own power in order to maintain peace. Naruto grimaced a little at that. The losses of half a dozen S-class Nukenin and the threat of the Bijou technique were mighty ones, but considered the offer. He hadn't been trained to be a diplomat, the only thing he really knew was how to kill, how to stay alive. Then again, the past 2 years alone had given him a fair idea of how the other countries operated under Pain's threat, making him aware of what he could expect from them as the Amicage. Plus, he still had Fu and Harrow at his side, not to mention Konan for support, and a tentative alliance with Sunagakur. He sighed, but looked up at Nagato with determined blue eyes. Fine, I'll do it. Nagato had passed away not long afterwards, bequeathing the title of Amicage to Naruto in a public announcement so as to assure there wouldn't be another civil war within the Hidden Reign. Konan had left to Otogakur, and with the loss of its leader, not to mention Itachi, who had died some time before Pain due to an illness, Akatsuki had disintegrated. Rumors had still abounded of the activities of men dressed in black cloaks with red clouds, and Naruto had often received intelligence reports of a potential uprising in one of the other hidden villages, only to be followed several days later by the quelling of said uprising, with evidence of massive explosions or missing organs or no visible external injuries decorating the corpses of murdered shinobi. He and Fu had continued to run missions to instill the fear of the living Jinchuriki into the hearts of his enemies, and Harrow had become both his advisor and an infiltration specialist, when the situation called for such skills. None of them had ever run into any of the former Akatsuki members, and Naruto wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disheartened at the lack of contact. In a strange way, he sort of missed his old teacher, though he doubted Kakuzu shared the same sentiment. Suddenly, the trapdoor that opened into his office slammed against the floor with a bang, causing the blonde to turn around and raise an eyebrow at the panting Ame-nin now in the room. "Amikage-sama," gasped the shinobi, an intruder. Tall, BL black cloak. Before anything else could be said, black tendrils emerged from the opening in the floor and wound around the man. He was lifted into the air as a large figure ascended the stairs into the room, an unconscious range shinobi wrapped in more tendrils being dragged along behind him. "Hello, brat," greeted Kakuzu. "Your security is lacking." Naruto sat in his chair with a small grin in place. "Speak of the devil. There aren't many people who can stand up to you, Kakuzu Ogi-san." Wham! "The years apart have not taught you much," Kakuzu growled, retracting his hand from his pupil's scalp and letting the blonde raise his head off the desk. A round, red mark decorated the center of his forehead, repayment for the barb at the former Taki nin's age. Harrow cleared his throat in an attempt to disperse the strange atmosphere in the room. "Ah, Kakuzu, if you could." He gestured at the two shinobi in the man's grasp. The Nukenin released his prisoners wordlessly, green eyes fixed on Naruto. Harrow signaled to the single, conscious shinobi that everything was okay, and the man took his cue to leave, doing so in a great hurry. Both thread users engaged in a silent stare down. Finally, Naruto said, "So, what are you doing here?" "I have come to see if your mediocre skills have deteriorated." A glint sparked in Naruto's blue eyes. "You're challenging me?" "Yes, though I doubt it will be challenging." Naruto stood up from his desk abruptly. "It's on." Harrow resisted the urge to slap his palm to his forehead. Even after over a decade of separation, Kakuzu and Naruto retained the same dynamic they'd had ever since he'd met them at the Chunin exam so long ago. The cobalt-haired male hurried after the duo, curious despite himself to see the outcome of the battle. LLL. "So where's your other half?" Behind his mask, Kakuzu scowled. Despite their animosity towards each other, Hidan had never left his side during his travels over the years. Kakuzu's assumption was that the Jashinist wished to somehow convert him to his religion, though he privately wondered if Hidan hadn't stuck around just to annoy him to death. "With your better half," he retorted. Naruto grimaced at that, though it was more because the thought of Hidan and his household with Fu was a bad one than out of any animosity Kakuzu's barb was supposed to invoke. After Kirigakure had finally stopped trying to rebel against the ultimatum for peace several years ago, there had never been any conclusive evidence as to why it had stopped, although a mix of rumors involving Akatsuki and the loss of the Hidden Mist's legendary swordsman and swords had spread like wildfire. He and his wife had decided to try for a second child. Their daughter was only 3 years old and still very impressionable, and Hidan's religious yammering and cussing would not be appreciated while Fu was watching over their youngest. That aside, Naruto hadn't actually expected such a definitive answer from Kakuzu. "I'm surprised, I thought for sure you would have left Hidan in pieces in a ditch somewhere." Kakuzu almost laughed. Truthfully, the thought had crossed his mind after Pain had passed away and Akatsuki had been formally dissolved, but the qualities that made Hidan such a nuisance to deal with also made him quite useful in attracting attention. In turn, that made the process of collecting bounties much smoother, as he could reap in larger quantities at a time, and without having to spend time looking for wandering Jinchuriki. The Nukenin's funds had increased dramatically. None of that prevented the Jashinist from taking forever with his rituals, or telling Kakuzu that he was going to go to hell, again, for collecting money, but the former Taki nin had solved those problems by either leaving Hidan behind to catch up or stitching his mouth shut. Without any more orders to follow, Kakuzu had been free to once more enjoy the bounties of life, and even with Hidan trailing him everywhere, he had done so with aplomb. The old Nukenin watched his pupil unwrap the bandages on his left arm, noting that the outfit he wore was virtually unchanged from when they had competed over the Rakubi Jinchuriki so many years before. He had been disappointed, perhaps, when Naruto had chosen to remain in Amigakure with Pain over the life of a free-roaming bounty hunter. Then again, Pain had offered the blonde a good life, one that Kakuzu knew he couldn't match. As Itachi had said, Naruto's and Fu's lives were their own now, and Kakuzu's disposition probably made the idea of following in his footsteps an unappealing one to the two Jinchuriki. His original plan of molding Naruto into his second coming had been somewhat successful in execution, but had then stumbled a bit once the blonde had taken up the post of Amikage. The difference, he supposed, was that he lived to kill, while his pupil killed to live. Kakuzu's thoughts had floated back to the younger thread user every once in a while, sometimes when he took out some shinobi attempting to fight against the hidden rain, other times when he needed something to muse on to ignore Hidan. He hadn't been curious enough to intrude upon the lives of the two Jinchuriki, especially when places he and Hidan had visited often held whispers of destruction wreaked by the blonde or green-haired demon containers, but each mention of their power made the Nuknin smirk grow a little wider. It was he who had spurred them to their current level of greatness, and every life they took held some signature of his name on it. He wasn't sure exactly what the tipping point was, but after more than a decade of roaming the world completely free of responsibility, the tales of Naruto and grumblings about the hidden rain's power had piqued his interest enough to want to drop in on his pupil. Naruto might not have followed the path Kakuzu had wanted him to, but that didn't mean that all the lessons he'd been taught had gone to waste. Consider this your final exam, brat. This is a fight to the death, he informed his pupil. He unbuttoned his Akatsuki cloak and threw it to the side. I hope your wife is prepared to be widowed. Naruto smirked back at his teacher. Did you kiss Hidan goodbye before you left him? I'm sure he'll miss his partner. I will kill you for that comment alone. Sitting on a pipe jutting out from a building high above the two shinobi, Haro watched as Kakuzu bent over and unleashed 4 masses of black threads from his back. The space they were fighting in was essentially a flat rock several hundred feet in diameter, completely surrounded by water and framed by buildings. It was the personal training area Naruto had claimed upon officially moving into Omegakure, and Haro had been his sparring partner often enough to know that the blonde's skill was nothing to sneeze at. Gray eyes flickered back to Kakuzu. Then again, Kakuzu is a powerful shinobi in his own right, and he probably taught Naruto a lot of what he knows. There's no telling what will happen. Down below, Naruto wound through seals as Kakuzu's threads and masks settled into the strange forms he was familiar with. 4 clones materialized, and almost immediately they abandoned their positions as wind, fire, lightning, and water rained down upon them. The blonde ignored the varied elements, choosing instead to charge at the older man in a burst of speed. Whatever taijutsu you attempt will be worthless, Kakuzu commented. His arms extended in a staggered maneuver meant to catch the blonde after he dodged the first fist, but Naruto dropped to his stomach instead. You never know, he retorted, sending his fists underground. They popped up with the intent of catching Kakuzu in an uppercut, but the former Taki Nin sidestepped with minimal effort, and the blonde could almost picture his teacher rolling his eyes at the futility. Kakuzu grabbed the tendrils extending from his pupil's forearms, preventing the Jinchuriki from retracting his limbs. He paused for a moment to observe Naruto, as if measuring his worth. Given how easily you were maneuvered into this position, the outcome of this battle seems apparent. The title of Kage seems to hold no meaning in this age. As he finished his verbal abuse, his fire mask interposed itself between the pair, a kernel of flames already formed in its mouth. Kaden, Zukoku. A massive explosion shook the air, and Haro wondered at the strength of both shinobi that he could feel the heat's intensity from his position. Kakuzu's attack was powerful, but the only reason the combustion had occurred on such a scale was because of Naruto. Practice over the years and possession of all elemental affinities had granted Naruto a virtually limitless arsenal of techniques. One of the ones he'd practiced with Haro had been the creation of a technique that could form several different types of clones in one movement, each one composed of a different element. The 4 doppelgangers he'd created at the beginning of the fight had been the result of that time, comprised of water, earth, storm, and wind. With the thread creature blocking Kakuzu's sight of Naruto, the blonde had replaced himself with the latter clone. The mass of black threads that contained Kakuzu's wind heart flew above the cloud of smoke engulfing the battlefield and exhaled a gust that blew the haze away. Naruto was revealed to be standing behind a rather large, red chameleon, his hand on the reptile's back. Kamigoka's head was tilted up at the flying thread creature. Yotan, Yoyua. Several waves of liquid magma erupted from the reptile's mouth, crashing over the airborne wind mask and melting it before it could move far enough away. What was it you told me? Naruto questioned, his tone mocking. Predictability kills? You only have so many moves, Kakuzu Ogi-san, and I know all of them. Kakuzu's brow furrowed in aggravation, though whether it was due to the loss of 2 of his hearts, Naruto's reference to his age, or the fact that the blonde actually had a fair point was unclear. You learned how to utilize combination attacks with your summons, he noted. By supplying a chameleon with a fire affinity with earth chakra, you can produce Yotan ninjutsu. He took a step forward, crushing the remnants of the fire mask that had been destroyed in the earlier explosion. The rest of Naruto's clones had also disappeared, though he remained unharmed due to activating the Earth Spear technique the moment Naruto's tendrils had disappeared from his grasp, signaling the blonde's substitution. And you managed to make a corporeal clone from an element as insubstantial as wind, Akaze Bunshine, impressive. Green eyes narrowed to slits. But the time for talking is over. You should have learned that with age comes experience, and you are still decades behind me. What are you? Naruto began, but Kakuzu had already blazed through seals, causing a thick mist to sprout into existence. Kirigakure no Jutsu? He wondered, but then a shortness of breath hit him and he went down to his knees, clutching his throat. What is this? Unfamiliar with the technique Kakuzu was using, Naruto switched his wind and storm hearts to extrude the former, allowing it to unleash a burst of air that dispersed the mist in the immediate vicinity. He was able to take a heaping gulp of air before the void was filled, and this time, the blonde could feel the vapor burning his skin. Reflexively activating the Earth Spear technique, Naruto looked behind him to find his thread creature liquefying into a puddle of black goo. I believe that my Futon, Nomu no Shisoku and Futon, Komu no Jutsu have proven you wrong, echoed Kakuzu's voice through the vapor, filled with condescension. Blue eyes went wide at that admission. The suffocating fog and skilled mist technique were both ninjutsu of the boil release chakra nature, a Kekkei Genkai that was in the possession of only one individual, last he'd checked. His revelation was cut short as a wave of lava cascaded towards him, and he hastily sprouted wings composed of black threads to get airborne. Jeong bore him above the mist and allowed him to alight upon the water, well out of the range of the deadly vapor. Even though the evidence pointed to Naruto's suspicion being right, he couldn't stop himself from asking, did you kill the? Curved vortexes of water rose to skewer him, and only his continued usage of the Earth Spear technique prevented him from being killed. Kakuzu came charging out of the mist, his remaining two masks placed in the spread of threads on his back that accompanied his change into the long-armed form. Both limbs lashed forward, boxing the blonde in, and making him a prime target for Kakuzu's lightning heart to unleash a lightning release, false darkness. Naruto dropped the earth ninjutsu and encased himself in a Kazekyu, simultaneously negating the incoming electricity and blowing Kakuzu's arms away from his personal space. His earth heart slipped out of his body, and as it dove towards his teacher in a feint, Naruto allowed Jeong to form around him in a parody of Kakuzu's form. His fire and water masks situated themselves above each shoulder. Bring it on, Kakuzu, this won't be like before. To his shock, a massive length of black tendrils ripped through Kakuzu's sleeveless top and wound about his thread creature. The mass containing his earth heart was ensnared within the Kinjutsu's grasp and pulled into the yawning hole that had opened in Kakuzu's stomach. It vanished within, and the former Taki Nin's skin stitched itself back together. Naruto gaped openly for a moment before managing to ask, "How did you do that?" "If you have to ask, then you are undeserving to know," retorted the Nukenin. Naruto scowled at that response, typical Kakuzu, and prepared himself for the next clash. He supposed that because he and Kakuzu were both carriers of Jeong, which could easily transplant organs, it wasn't too far a stretch to assume that one thread user could steal hearts, even previously stolen ones, from another. After all, he remembered, he had transferred a heart into Kakuzu's corpse after the man had died. This was practically the same thing. Still, it wasn't a move he would have expected. Now he knew to keep the rest of his hearts at his side. Not only could Kakuzu steal them if they roamed autonomously as thread creatures, but they were far more vulnerable in that state, and he was currently down 2 hearts to his teacher's 1. I can rectify that, he thought, but I'll need a couple seconds to charge, and the minute he sees me making seals, he'll attack. That meant that he would have to take the offensive and find a way to stall his teacher long enough to get off his attack. He almost snorted at the likelihood of that actually happening. The playfulness and time for exchanging barbs with Kakuzu passed in light of the man's seriousness. Naruto flipped through hand signs, and sure enough, Kakuzu immediately attacked, a bolt of lightning surging forward from the appropriate mask. He summoned a Suijin Heki and jumped up. The liquid absorbed the current as Naruto sprouted black wings once more and soared over to the piece of land in the middle of the training area, the thick fog having vanished. Kakuzu, standing on a piece of hardened water that hadn't conducted the electricity, turned and allowed the water and lightning masks to shoot out a combination attack at the blonde. He blocked with a mass of threads that twined together from his wrists, and then plummeted towards the ground, hardened fist poised to strike. Haro's eyes went wide just before Naruto reached land with a shout of Doden, Urugasu Chiho no Jutsu. The cobalt-haired man looked around and found that several other Ame nin had arrived on the scene to cheer on their leader, all of them watching from different perches on the surrounding pipes and buildings as he was. "Back up," he yelled, jumping up to the rooftop as the shockwave from the shattering earth technique struck. The rest of the Rain Shinobi hastened to obey, and Harrow returned his attention to the fight, waiting for the Amikage's successive ninjutsu. The triple attack Naruto was about to employ was impressive enough that the buildings they were all crouched on had only been rebuilt after Naruto had perfected his control of the combination. Kakuzu looked to be regaining his equilibrium on the choppy water when the liquid parted into two towering waves that loomed over him momentarily. He surveyed the incoming deluge impassively, sparing his student a brief glance before forming seals. Doden, Iwa no Hinanshu. Earth rose up and encapsulated him in a hemispheric shell as Naruto called out, Suten, Tsunami no Jutsu. All the water that had been held up by Naruto's chakra crashed down upon the earthen dome, battering it relentlessly. Naruto, already aware that Kakuzu would survive, was preparing the third ninjutsu technique, wind whipping around him in a violent twister and picking up the surrounding water. As soon as Kakuzu surfaced, one hardened fist punching through his own defense and allowing him to utilize chakra to rise up, Naruto unleashed the wind and water assault, announcing, Futon, Taifu no Jutsu. The twister surged forward and sucked Kakuzu into its vortex. Before the former Taki Nin was drawn too far into the technique, he laced his hands together into the sign of the snake and intoned, Doden, Keijigen no Jutsu. He dropped like a stone through the tempest, falling into the water and releasing the technique to buoy back to the surface. Wet tangles of dark brown hair hung before his eyes, and he realized that somewhere in the slew of attacks, he had lost his forehead protector, head covering, and mask. A rather ostentatious combination, but ultimately ineffective, he informed his pupil. Not quite, Naruto thought, hands clasped together with a nimbus of bluish-white energy formed around it. Taking one last second to concentrate on what he was doing, he took a breath and released his hold on the technique. Ranten, Reiza Sakasu. Beams of light erupted from the halo of energy that surrounded his hands, all of them targeting Kakuzu. Over time, and with a library of information Pain had recovered from Orochimaru, the blonde had eventually learned the actual secret to utilizing the storm release Kekkei Genkai effectively. Split into separate beams, the laser circus technique wasn't exactly strong at killing humans. The light cannon did that job plenty well, but then again, Naruto's target wasn't Kakuzu himself. Kakuzu raised a wall of water in a vain attempt at stalling the attack, but the energy simply penetrated the liquid and slammed into his body. The areas they struck burned slightly, but aside from that, there wasn't any real damage. It was only when a cracking sound emitted next to each ear that he realized the true targets. The sight of his lightning and water masks crumbling to the ground merely confirmed his suspicion. So, he stated, returning the surrounding threads to his body and regaining his human form, it seems your skill, meager though it was, has improved somewhat. Naruto didn't bother responding. It appears he is taking this seriously, good. Kakuzu's lips twitched minutely. Let us see who will emerge victorious, now that the endgame has begun. He collected chakra in his chest, feeling the roiling torrent of the fire and earth elements mixing together. If Naruto wanted to utilize his stolen Kekkei Genkai to get ahead, then Kakuzu would oblige his student by doing the same. Yotan, Shikagaryugen no Jutsu, he muttered. Lava spewed forth from his mouth, forming into countless, flaming orbs. Naruto raised a thick wall of earth to protect himself from the lava release, scorching steam rock technique, but the miniature meteors smashed through it as if it was glass. The blonde crossed his arms before his face and allowed the earth spear technique to absorb most of the impact, though every collision still jarred his body. When the assault finally stopped, he glanced up to find that a thick mist was obscuring his vision. He immediately recalled the two masks sitting on his shoulders back into his body and shifted them so that his water heart was in his chest. Unsure as to how powerful the vapor's melting properties were, he summoned an armor of rock to cover his body, dropping the earth spear technique. Silence reigned for a long moment, and then Kakuzu appeared out of the mist and delivered a brutal punch to Naruto's chest, shattering the stone covering with his strength. The blonde grunted at the impact, skidding backwards a fair distance, and before he could completely recover, Kakuzu appeared in front of him and shot his hand into the opening he had created. Naruto realized the ploy for what it was just as threads began to creep around his heart. I will take Kumagakure's vaunted Ranten Kekkei Genkai, Kakuzu informed him matter-of-factly. This isn't Futon, it's just Kirigakure no Jutsu, Naruto concluded. Kakuzu's real goal was to assimilate another one of his hearts into his own body. Fuck that. He commanded his own Kinjutsu to wind around the same heart his teacher was prepared to take, his water one, and squished it as a mask popped up over his shoulder, an orb of bluish-white light forming in its mouth. Try, again, he gasped, moving his fire heart to displace the ruined water one. So much simultaneous, internal body manipulation required focus, even taking into account Jeong's sentience and his 20 years of experience with it. Kakuzu's green eyes narrowed in aggravation at being denied his prize, and he jerked sideways to avoid the storm release light cannon that erupted from Naruto's mask. Fortunately, the movement saved him from taking the attack directly through the heart. However, the beam, only a couple of inches in diameter, formed smaller in order to catch Kakuzu off guard, tore through the right side of his chest, blasting the mask containing Naruto's pilfered earth heart to smithereens. White porcelain crumbled to the ground as the Rantan heart returned to Naruto's body, the blonde melding into the ground and resurfacing several dozen feet away to give himself time to regroup. Kakuzu felt the spot where the energy beam had gone through, feeling more than seeing the threads of Jeong stitch the wound close. Intelligent, to not allow me access to his hearts in order to replenish my own. The brat has certainly grown smarter. Similarly, Naruto ran a hand over the spot Kakuzu had inserted his hand, failing to repress a shudder at the invasive feel of his teacher's kinjutsu in his body. There was something distinctly wrong about what had just occurred, and though he wanted a long shower to rid himself of the feeling, he knew that his focus had to be entirely on what the old bounty hunter was planning next. Kakuzu was unlikely to give up on trying to get at least one of his hearts in order to gain the upper hand. But he could take advantage of that moment, he realized. After all, in the previous exchange, both had lost a heart, but Naruto was still up one heart on his teacher. If he could maneuver the former Taki nin into a position where his greed for a heart would override his other impulses, then the blonde could do another one-for-one trade-off and still emerge victorious. He finalized his decision just as Kakuzu finished a series of hand seals, and suddenly the water surrounding the flat rock they were on began to bubble and boil, steam rising off it in waves. Naruto could feel the heat emanating from the pool of hot liquid from his position far from the edge of the rock, and he wondered if people possessing advanced chakra natures such as boil or lava release were born immune to the sweltering temperatures incited by their bloodlines. The water level began to slowly rise, and Naruto knew he needed to put his plan into action immediately in order to stop whatever tactic his teacher was trying to employ. Wind swirled around him to materialize into a trio of Kaze Bunshine, all of whom charged at Kakuzu to engage in a taijutsu battle. They wouldn't stand too much of a chance, because the older male was far better with hand-to-hand combat than he was, but they merely needed to stall for several seconds. With Kakuzu temporarily distracted, the Kyubi Jinchuriki sprouted black wings from his back and took to the air, rising above the man and extruding his fire heart, leaving his storm one in his chest cavity. An orb of flame formed in the mask's mouth, and Kakuzu seemed to know what was going to happen, for he immediately ran through seals. A hollow pillar of magma erupted from the earth with him at the epicenter, aimed to engulf the blonde. There was a huge buffet of air as Naruto's wind clones were dispersed by the technique. Instead of using slicing wind, the blonde had created these doppelgangers with blunt air, and Kakuzu, eyes on his pupil, was blown off his feet by the force of the currents. From his position on his back, he observed Naruto's fire thread creature sacrifice itself to his lava release, eruption technique, the blonde releasing a full-body violent wind palm to propel himself towards the ground. As Naruto descended upon him, years of instincts had his skin take on the dark discoloration of the earth spear technique. Whatever plan his blonde pupil had, there were only a handful of techniques that could actually break through the hardening maneuver, and, given the blonde's propensity for wind jutsu, he doubted his protégé's idea took that factor into account. A second later, the former Taki nin was surprised when he felt the threads of Jeong pierce his hardened flesh. Naruto knelt over him with numerous black tendrils extending from the stitches in his forearms, the blue-white lightning crackling down their lengths giving them the appearance of live wires. The kinjutsu had perforated his legs, arms, and torso, keeping him pinned to the ground, and one more was quivering a hair's breadth from his last heart. Clever, Kakuzu allowed, channeling chakra through Jeong in order to negate the defensive properties of Doten, Domu. Predictability kills, Naruto told him quietly. His blue eyes were hard with resolve, and Kakuzu met them with a measured gaze. After a moment, he laughed darkly. How true, he granted, closing his eyes. So, it appears as if the pupil has surpassed the master. He has exceeded the expectations I had for him. Naruto was no longer the young boy he'd taken from the forests of the Land of Fire, nor was he the childish adolescent fighting for his mentor's approval and the destruction of a village which had slighted him. He was an adult, the ruler of a nation, and the world, in a way, and, apparently, the stronger shinobi. The old Nukenin waited for the final blow to come, but when it didn't, he opened his eyes. His pupil was staring at him with a curious expression on his face. You have yet to finish me off. Do not tell me you are so weak as to be unable to take my life. You want to die? Kakuzu fixed the Amicage with an unwavering look. If you are prepared, there will not be any sorrow. I came here with one of two outcomes in mind, Either you would die at my hand and be judged unworthy of being my successor, or I would die and my legacy would continue through you. This sentimentality is unbecoming of a hardened bounty hunter." Naruto returned the gaze evenly for a long moment, not saying anything. Despite what the bounty hunter said, he wasn't sure whether Kakuzu would have actually killed him or not, but he knew that he was tired of trying to meet his teacher's expectations. Finally, he said, "You know, Kakuzu, you taught me a lot of things over the years. Taijutsu, ninjutsu, how to survive. Granted, your methods were a bit unorthodox, but I appreciated the fact that you took the time out to teach me the things you'd learned from your considerable experience." He grinned a little at the emphasis on the Nukenin's age, enjoying the jab at his teacher while he retained the upper hand. Kakuzu had taken so many potshots at him over the years that it felt good to return the favor. "But even through all that, I think the one lesson you taught me that I always paid attention to was the value of a person's life. And I think you're worth more to me alive than dead." The ex-waterfall shinobi felt the threads holding him in place withdraw. He sat up as they finished disappearing beneath his pupil's skin. Green eyes gazed around at the conglomeration of Ame Nin that had steadily appeared over the course of his fight with the younger thread user. He scoffed as two familiar heads, one mint green, the other cobalt blue, jumped down from the assorted gathering and approached them, two smaller figures in tow. "Your time serving as Amikage has made you tender-hearted if you consider any previous relationship we once shared valuable." The blonde shook his head as Fu and Harrow came to stand beside him, the former holding a girl with hair a shade paler than her mother's, the latter putting down another blonde who immediately ran to Naruto's side. Kakuzu estimated him to be 10 years of age, though his attention quickly returned to his pupil when Naruto said, "You misunderstood me. I think you could be a great asset to this village, if you want to join. Maybe you could even become Keizo's teacher," he added, patting the blonde boy on the head. "And if not?" He shrugged, "Well, I'm certain there are other ways you can repay me for sparing your life." Kakuzu snorted at the offer, and at the fact that the Jinchuriki's son was also named after a shogi piece, a trait meant to honor him, he assumed, though there was a strange appeal to teaching his students' progeny the ways of the world. "Still, I would no sooner join a hidden village than you would abandon yours." Naruto grinned a little, seeming to have been expecting such an answer. "Fair enough. We can work something out, I'm sure." Ignoring his teacher, he turned to address Fu. "Where's Hidan?" "Sleeping," she responded in a tone that implied the Jashinist had been forced into the activity. "Thanks for that, by the way," she mentioned to Kakuzu. The bounty hunter hummed carelessly, ignoring her dryness. Naruto interposed himself back into the conversion, prompting, "So, the Mizukage, huh?" Kakuzu made a noncommittal noise in response. "You know, we were having a lot of issues with Kiri, and then, after rumors of Akatsuki showing up there sprouted, there were no more issues." "I did not do it for you, if that is what you are implying," snapped the older thread user. She was a lucrative, challenging target, with 2 Kekkei Genkai to her name. Any repercussions of her demise were merely coincidental. Sure. A beat of silence, and then, "I might have to go confront the Raikage soon. He keeps pushing for an alliance with Iwa in order to wrest power from Ame. But I hear he's guarded by a lot of people with pretty hefty bounties on their head." Kakuzu didn't even try to conceal his interest. How intriguing. He appeared contemplative for a long moment, and then allowed the suture holding his chest together to unweave, revealing a pulsing mass of darkness. One hand reached in and then withdrew seconds later, a small scroll clenched tightly in its grip. As his chest was stitched back together, he tossed the object at his pupil. "This is for you." Naruto stared at the object for a moment, stunned. "This is..." "Yes. I have no reason to keep it. Consider it an acquired Kekkei Genkai for your lineage." The word family was too distasteful on his tongue. He stood up and moved to grab his Akatsuki cloak, which was waterlogged, dirt-smeared, and possessed a plethora of rips and holes. Heedless of the condition, he shrugged it on and closed the front. Keeping his back to the small group, he stated, "Naruto, you have grown into an impressive shinobi. We have not always seen eye to eye, but it is gratifying to see that you became some semblance of the man I intended you to be." The blonde nodded solemnly, and though he knew Kakuzu couldn't see it, he thought his teacher could sense the motion regardless. To have the old thread user acknowledge him by name and praise him, it was the sort of thing he'd sought for most of his life. "Thanks, Kakuzu." Kakuzu pretended not to hear him. "I will take Hidan with me, he may yet prove useful in Kumo." He began walking away, offering a departing intonation of Harrow, "Fu, Naruto, until the next time our paths cross." The family of 4 plus Harrow watched the bounty hunter disappear into the distance with a myriad of expressions. Naruto looked down when he felt a tug on his pants. Keizo was glancing up at him curiously with blue eyes. Dad, who was that? Naruto placed a hand on his son's head. That was my old sensei, Kakuzu, the greatest bounty hunter the world will ever see, and the closest thing you'll ever have to a grandfather. Keizo absorbed this information silently before asking, will we ever see him again? The older blonde looked into the distance where his former teacher had vanished. I don't know, he admitted, but I hope so, and Yotan makes 5. Kakuzu dropped the corpse of the Iwa Nin as the tendrils of Jeong brought the man's heart into his own body. That task taken care of, he massaged the back of his neck with one hand, tilting his head one way and then the other until he heard a satisfying crack. He stared at the motionless body of his latest victim, green and red eyes blank. It had taken over 110 years, but the old bounty hunter was bored. He wasn't even sure how it had happened, but the combination of circumstances over the years had resulted in a world that left little for him to do. In order to challenge himself, he'd set about collecting the various specialty chakra natures of shinobi the world over, his mastery of the primary 5 elements completed long ago. With the addition of the, technically second, lava release heart, his collection, boil, explosion, magnet, and storm, as he wasn't allowed to touch Suna's scorch users, was complete. The burning question of what he was to do next remained unanswered, and Kakuzu wondered if he'd finally approached the end of his time. He'd seen and done much in his life, more than most shinobi could claim they'd ever be able to accomplish in several lifetimes, joining Akatsuki's inner circle, savoring the destruction of Konohagakure, the only village aside from the hidden waterfall to be a source of his loathing, raising a Jinchuriki to become the cage of a new world power. Not to mention that the world was in the nearest state of peace it had seen since before the Warring Clans era. Of course, he could always stir the pot, start a war and reap the benefits as he'd done thrice before during world conflicts, but the old Nukenin found that he didn't want to. While tentative peace wasn't something he had ever sought, hadn't even considered as a possibility, to be honest, he had to admit that the idea of a unified world didn't repulse him as much as he'd expected it to, probably because his former pupil was essentially its overseer. Naruto. Somehow, everything started and ended with his protégé. If Kakuzu hadn't found the blonde at the impressionable age of 5, hadn't tried to kill him and in turn be impressed by his regenerative abilities, how different would the world, would he, be? Akatsuki's plan might still have succeeded, but there was no guarantee that the bounty hunter would have played the role he did in it. He'd wasted a lot of time watching over Naruto and running errands for Akatsuki, time that would have otherwise been spent bounty hunting for pleasure, the same thing he'd done for decades. But, thanks to that chance encounter with Naruto, his life had gone from monotonous to adventurous. Kakuzu had never quite figured out if that had been a good thing or not, but as he refused to live with regret, he'd merely returned to his old ways and tried to balance his newer experiences with the older ones. His amusement at causing Naruto suffering, for instance, had to be checked. While it would be fun to make trouble for the blonde by stirring the pot, he was also indebted to his young disciple. Naruto had proven 6 years ago that he had the power to beat his ex-teacher, passing the test Kakuzu had planned for him since they'd met almost 30 years ago. If there was one thing the bounty hunter hated, it was owing someone something, and so he had tempered his inclinations to cause the Amikage anguish and instead focused on more, destructively, constructive pastimes. He brought his hand up to eye level, staring at the ring still placed on his middle finger. One of the reasons he'd remained loyal to Akatsuki even after the organization's breakup was that following the will of pain was the only gesture he could think of to repay the man for his actions, saving his life after dying at the hands of Konoha Nin. Kakuzu refused to give Naruto credit for that, and letting his disciples live. It was about the only thing he could do to honor the man's efforts and sacrifice. The rustling of trees drew him from his memories, and he looked up in time to see 2 blurs pass by, a platinum blonde being chased by a figure with Naruto's nostalgic shock of yellow hair. Curiosity piqued, he took off after the pair, tracking them silently. The pursuer's arms moved in a way that Kakuzu assumed he was forming seals before he threw them forward with a called, Raiten, Mahimo. Interesting, thought the bounty hunter, watching as a net of lightning chakra flew towards the platinum blonde. The other shinobi, one wearing the white flak jacket of Akumo Nin, turned around, absorbed the attack, and then fired it back at his pursuer with increased power. Stupid as Naruto, to use a Raiten attack against Akumo Nin, Kakuzu considered snidely, but quicker on his feet, he rectified, observing as the blonde exhaled a gale of wind chakra to cancel out the attack. A retrieval mission, perhaps, he thought, interest piqued further as he analyzed the non-lethal lightning release attack the young shinobi had used. A blonde wearing the shinobi outfit of a Migakure, that was almost too much of a coincidence for him to ignore. Knowing that the mystery would bother him until he could solve it, the former Taki Nin sighed to himself. Just as with that brat so long ago, a little assistance from one more experienced is necessary. Moving a bit faster so that he was nearer to the Cloud Shinobi, he formed 2 quick hand signs, his focus on the ninja ahead of him. Jitten, Kinzoku Haiki Komi, he thought, reaching out for the metal comprising the Kumo Nin's weapons and buttons. In the next instant, the Cloud Shinobi was flying towards a tree of Kakuzu's choosing, where the magnetic force of his metal pull technique kept him immobilized. The blonde seemed to take the unusual behavior in stride, just like Naruto would, Kakuzu thought with snide amusement, descending upon the hapless shinobi and dispatching him with a slice of wind chakra applied to a kunai. Brutal, efficient. 3 kunai were thrown at his position, forcing him to dodge or be skewered by more wind chakra. "Who's there?" called the blonde. "More intelligent than he looks, too." Kakuzu stepped out from his hiding spot, arms hanging loosely at his sides. The blonde's blue eyes widened just slightly. You're Kakuzu." He breathed in awe. Now that Kakuzu had a good look at him, the resemblance was unmistakable. "And you are the brat's little pawn." The boy frowned at how dismissive the taller shinobi sounded. "His knight, actually," he muttered, somewhere between offended and embarrassed. "My name's Keizo." "I am aware of who you are," Kakuzu interjected in a tone that indicated he could care less. Keizo seemed to be caught flat-footed at the older shinobi's apathy, and he lapsed into silence for a moment before trying, "Dad says you're like my grandfather." Kakuzu cringed internally, though he refused to let any sliver of emotion pass over his visible features. Apparently Naruto's years as a family man had imparted upon him an even stronger sense of sentimentality than he'd possessed during his teenage period, and he was passing it down to his children. He considered refuting the claim, not wanting to get sucked into his blonde pupil's warped views of family, but then he paused. When he'd been a boy growing up in the hidden waterfall village, hadn't the one thing he'd sought above all else been his grandfather's approval? Granted, it had ultimately left him with nothing but spite and scorn, but the fact remained that most children looked up to their older relatives. And while Kakuzu had intentionally remained taciturn and withdrawn in his dealings with Naruto in order to mold him into the ideal shinobi, into his second coming, he held no such expectations that Keizo would follow the same path, regardless of how he treated the boy. Plus, if he was anything like Naruto, Keizo would just run with whatever small irritations Kakuzu let on, so, instead of retorting with his normal snark, he let the term of endearment go and instead asked, "What has your father told you about me?" Keizo looked thoughtful. "He liked to tell us bedtime stories about you, but I don't think we ever really believed them until you came to Ame and fought him. You're scary strong." Kakuzu allowed himself an amused smirk beneath his mask. Practically a mythological tale to children, like the stories of Susanoo, Tsukiyomi, and Amaterasu, how my infamy has been embellished. "I see." Green eyes glanced over at the corpse of the Kumo Nin. "Tell me about him." "Spy," the blonde sighed. He scratched the back of his head in a gesture reminiscent of his father when he was at a loss. "It looks like Kumo and Iwa are working together to launch one more offensive against Ame and its allies." Kakuzu scowled to himself. Years ago, when Naruto had given him the task of dealing with the Raikage, he'd only been able to delay the man's plans. Unlike the Mizukage, the Raikage's shinobi prowess had proven an adept counter to Kakuzu's strengths, and in order to fight another day, he and his partner had been forced to flee prematurely, despite how sour a taste it had left in his mouth. Over the following years, there had been rumors of the Hidden Rock and Hidden Cloud colluding together, especially as the threat of the bomb that had destroyed the Hidden Leaf had faded into obscurity. Even with his pride wounded in his fight with the Raikage, Kakuzu had refused to get involved further, considering the problem his pupils, not his. Now it seemed as if the rumors were coming to a head. A final battle, then, he mused. "Tell me, pawn." Keizo opened his mouth to protest the nickname, but Kakuzu continued before he could, "How prepared are you to participate in this coming war?" "I dunno, I mean, it's us, Suna, Otto, and Kiri, so I think we're good." Kakuzu was already shaking his head. The boy had misunderstood his question. "Fight me." "Huh?" "Fight me," Kakuzu repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Keizo's expression morphed into one somewhere between stunned and terrified. "Are you gonna kill me?" The bounty hunter resisted the urge to roll his eyes at the naivety of youth. Instead, he reached into his cloak and pulled out a book from the pocket he normally kept it in. "Are you in here?" he questioned, making sure the boy could see the words that labeled it a bingo book. "No?" Keizo replied slowly, clearly unsure whether that was the correct answer to give. "Then your body is worthless to me," Kakuzu told him, choosing not to say you are worthless to me as he would have with Naruto. He put the book away, musing idly on his previously unfounded magnanimity. No, I wish to test your mettle. You may attack with whatever tricks you possess. Naruto's son looked unsure, but as Kakuzu stood stolidly and simply waited for the boy to take some sort of action, he seemed to realize the old Nukenin wasn't joking around. Slowly, almost in expectation of the former Taki Nin to stop him, he began to form seals. Raiten, Rakurai, he announced, tongues of bluish-white lightning chakra crackling about his fingers. He pointed at Kakuzu, and a bolt of the energy lanced forward in an attempt to skewer the taller shinobi. The bounty hunter frowned beneath his mask as he sidestepped the attack, dodging the next several bolts the blonde threw at him. He telegraphs his attacks too loudly. The lightning stopped suddenly, and Keizo withdrew 2 kunai from his pouch and came charging at Kakuzu, thrumming blades of wind chakra erupting along the lengths of the knives. There is a predictability to his assault that exposes him to retaliation, he observed, remembering the lesson he'd taught to and relearned from Naruto. Predictability killed. Dodging the slashes of the elongated weapons was practically second nature to a man of his caliber. Why don't you fight back? Keizo huffed, accentuating each word with another slash of his weapons. And he possesses Naruto's short-sightedness. The apple does not fall far from the tree. I was unaware that I should do so. Are you testing my mettle? No, but what's the point of hitting a target who won't hit back? He snapped. You have yet to hit me, Kakuzu intoned matter-of-factly, but if you insist. He waited for the right moment in the boy's movements before planting his fist squarely in Keizo's stomach. Despite not having his earth spear technique active, Kakuzu's punch still sent the blonde skidding back a number of feet and forcing him to his knees, breath coming in choked wheezes. The first lesson you should take from this is to not ask for more than you are prepared to handle, he lectured, advancing upon his adversary. Reaching him, he grabbed the boy by both shoulders, lifted him into the air, and twisted casually, heaving him into the nearby treetops. Secondly, do not retain a rhythm to your attacks, it leaves your opponent the opportunity to discover and exploit it. When there was no response from the surrounding forest, Kakuzu announced, you may continue when you are sufficiently recovered, this exercise is not yet over. Silence greeted this proclamation, forcing him to assume that the blonde had taken his words to heart and was actually planning his next move. It was an interesting experience to once again be passing down the tricks of the trade to the younger generation, albeit in a more direct capacity than he'd used with the boy's father. Not that Naruto hadn't proven himself a capable shinobi under his tutelage, but Kakuzu had always known that he wasn't the most adept teacher. But this situation was different. Kakuzu had no reason to manipulate this child, no reason to discourage what lessons he could impart in the short window of time he'd been presented. Keizo also had no preconceived notions of what Kakuzu was like, barring whatever fairy tales Naruto had cooked up as bedtime stories for his children, and so the bounty hunter saw no purpose in disguising his intentions with sarcastic barbs and deadpan put-downs. A whistling of wind caught the Nukenin's attention, and his focus shifted to a small sphere of condensed chakra that was barreling towards him. Green eyes narrowed in careful analysis of the assault. So, Naruto taught him Futon, Kusaku Kokiden. Impressive. He took 2 steps backward before the drilling air bullet impacted the ground just in front of him, creating a massive gale of hurricane winds that kicked up dirt and forced Kakuzu to shield his face from the debris. The boy learns quickly, he noted, to stop announcing his attacks and create a smokescreen. However, he turned and brought his arm up, knocking aside the chakra-laced kunai Keizo had been prepared to stab him with. How? You are not the first to attempt such a strategy, Kakuzu stated, though I give you credit for your increased stealth. Keizo released a sound that Kakuzu almost called a growl before jabbing at him with one hand. The former Taki Nin took another step back, causing the attack to come up short, and then continued to evade as the blonde moved into a fast-paced series of strikes. Kakuzu observed the pattern as he continued to dodge and block, mentally tallying the few openings that presented themselves. This taijutsu style is familiar. After another minute of allowing Keizo to fruitlessly attack him, Kakuzu stuck out his arm at the next jab, black threads erupting from the long suture around his forearm and winding around the offending limb. The bounty hunter reveled in the way Keizo's blue eyes widened in surprise, silently approving how the boy was taken off guard for only a moment before using his other arm to try and free himself. In response, more threads wriggled their way out from under his skin, creating a makeshift set of manacles that kept the blonde suspended in mid-air, immobile. Is this Jeong? Yes. Kakuzu peered at him curiously. Naruto did not impart upon you this secret? Keizo shook his head. Dad doesn't use it when we spar, said it's dangerous. He told me that once I become a Jonin, He would let me decide whether or not I want to learn the secrets of Jeong, but I haven't really seen it used, except when you fought Dad. Kakuzu slowly set the boy down and commanded the black tendrils to release their captive. Keizo watched the Kinjutsu with silent interest. Tell me, little pawn, who has been in charge of your training? Dad and Haro-san. The bounty hunter nodded in confirmation of his suspicions. Keizo's taijutsu katas were very fluid, and that in his Raiten jutsu had Haro's fingerprints all over them. His ability to use the drilling air bullet was further evidence that Naruto had also had an understandably heavy hand in his son's growth. And do you desire to acquire Jeong? Yeah. 9 times. Huh? 9 times I had an opening to kill you in our last exchange, the Nuknin elaborated, making allowances for the boy to follow his non-sequiturs. Should you possess the ambition to become another carrier of Jeong, you will need to become strong enough that these weaknesses are no longer so apparent. He didn't bother pointing out that only a ninja of his own caliber actually had the capacity to spot and capitalize on such openings. What the boy didn't know would only help spur him on to bigger and better things. Oh, thanks. Kakuzu inclined his head once in a gesture of acknowledgement before lapsing into silent contemplation. The boy was well on his way to becoming an adept shinobi, a future possessor of a powerful kinjutsu capable of maintaining some degree of order in the world. Naruto was smart to not expose his son to the lure that the Earth Grudge Fear technique would have until he was strong enough to wield and understand it properly. That was, after all, the criteria Kakuzu himself had used for his blonde pupil, to contain the most powerful of the Bijou and survive the bounty hunter's criticism and antagonism. Naruto had proven himself worthy of possessing the Kinjutsu. It certainly hadn't hurt that the Jinchuriki's background had mirrored his own so well, but that was an excuse that those prone to attachment offered, and Kakuzu considered himself beyond such useless sentimentality. Still, the boy before him simply seemed to want to improve himself, and the old Nuknin could respect such initiative. After all, the motivation for his training a lifetime ago had been to impress the hard-to-please Takahashi Hiroki. And Hiroki had done nothing but screw his grandson over time and time again. Kakuzu didn't want to be like his grandfather, didn't really want to be considered a grandfather by the teenager standing before him, if he was honest, though it was probably too late for that, and he certainly didn't want all of his effort going to waste. If you are prepared, there will not be any sorrow. It was a phrase he had picked up not long after his escape from Takigakure, one he thought had applied rather well to his life. But such a mindset had made him an eternal pragmatist, and so he'd stopped hoping for things that he saw as beyond his reach. Perhaps it was time to correct that. Iwagakure and Kumagakure, you said, he reaffirmed. The boy nodded once, blue eyes puzzled. Very well. Then, with no other preamble, he began to tread in the direction of the hidden rock village. Wait. Where are you going? To remove the opposition. By yourself? You'll be killed. Kakuzu turned around so that he was once again facing the blonde. He unbuttoned his Akatsuki cloak with methodical slowness, holding it in his hand once he'd finished. Then, grunting with effort, the masks containing the hearts captured by Jeong burst from his back in pulsating masses of black threads, reforming into demonic impressions of animals. One at a time, Keizo watched in awe as the masks unleashed a variety of attacks, flowing torrents of lava, beams of bluish-white light, black whips that caused explosions with everything they cracked against, at the surrounding foliage. I am a one-man army, Kakuzu informed the stunned boy tonelessly. Wow. Kakuzu nodded to himself. The display had been enough to convince his grandson, and that was enough. The legacy of Akatsuki was that each of the members possessed the abilities and history to strike fear into the hearts of most mortal men, and Pain's position as leader of the organization had meant that he was the most feared of all. It had therefore come as a surprise to discover that Pain's machinations were to ultimately create world peace, but then again, manipulation was key to surviving in the shinobi world. In that vein, Kakuzu could appreciate the extents Akatsuki's leader had gone to in order to make sure his plan succeeded, even as one who had been used to accomplish its end. Akatsuki had been composed of broken, deranged individuals all looking for something different. Deidara had craved destruction, Sasori had sought appreciation, Kakuzu had thirsted for money, all working towards an ironic conclusion of Pain's construction. But with his death, the reins keeping the individual members lashed to Akatsuki's endgame had broken, and everyone had been free to pursue their own goals once again. Some of them were nobler than others. Kisame, for instance, had fought for control of Kirigakure and was currently restructuring its government to reflect his own dream, a world without lies. He'd confided in Kakuzu as they'd prepared to take down Mei and her army. Konan was still in charge of a flourishing Otogakure, upholding Pain's idea of peace by turning the hidden sound into an up-and-coming world power. In the spirit of former alliances, the blue-haired woman had offered asylum to any Akatsuki member willing to abide by Oto's, and Pain's, rules, and Kakuzu knew for a fact that both Zetsu and Sasori had their own havens within the Hidden Sound where they dabbled in their respective interests. But for shinobi like Deidara, Hidan, him, world peace was a detriment. Their reputations were based on carnage and destruction, and with serenity came a lack of cities to blow up, people to sacrifice to a deity who demanded violence, conflict to create powerful bounties for Kakuzu to hunt and fight and cash in for money. But just as the new world threatened their lifestyles, so were they threats to it. That was why he had dismembered Hidan and left him for the buzzards in the middle of the Land of Wind, and why Sasori had a blonde puppet with access to the Hidden Rock's prized explosion release Kekkei Genkai. That was why Kakuzu had embarked on various challenges, including his own bloodline limit hunt, to keep his mind off the fact that he was becoming obsolete in a world no longer dominated by the wars that had plagued his life since birth. Unsure how to mesh into the changing world, Kakuzu had taken a long step back and looked for some other purpose in life. The startling conclusion he'd reached was one similar to Kisame's ideal, not necessarily a world of truth, but one in which shinobi were respected by their villages for risking their necks in the line of duty, for sacrificing everything for the village regardless of whether their objective was achieved. A world where the injustice of what Takigakure had done to him almost a century ago was non-existent. Naruto, Conan, and Kisame had already shown their dedication towards maintaining that type of existence. Even the Kazekage had kept a firm hold over the now recovered Hidden Sand, enough so that the only threats to peace were the Hidden Cloud and Hidden Rock. And even though Kakuzu harbored a sliver of goodwill towards building a better world, he knew that he had no place in it. He was too corrupt, too jaded by a century of hardship and exile to survive in the world his fellow Nukenin and star pupil sought to build and uphold. Nor did he wish to proactively work towards implementing such change in the same way as his former associates were doing. In that sense, there was only one move left for him to make, the sheer magnitude of which would earn him his rightful place in the annals of history. For even as Naruto held the world in the palm of his hand, Kakuzu would remain unremembered for his deeds, a puppeteer faded into the woodwork of his greatest masterpiece. And after how long he'd lived and all he'd accomplished, the former Taki Nin refused to go out like that. So he would once again leave behind a legacy, but this time it would surpass even what he'd intended for Naruto to become. Kakuzu almost blamed his ex-pupil for how his life had turned out. If he'd never met Naruto, it was entirely possible he'd never become as damnably soft as he now saw himself. Working with, towards, and for the benefit of others, how ingratiating. There was something almost ironic about what he was planning, though Kakuzu feared that if he looked too deeply, he'd find a reason to change his mind, and fickleness wasn't a trait he found very becoming. "You cannot tell anyone that you met up with me," he warned Keizo as his thread creatures buried themselves in his back. He threw on his cloak and then turned around, withdrawing his bingo book once more, along with a pen. "Oh." Keizo almost sounded disappointed at the command. "How come?" There was a brief flash of deep green before Kakuzu turned back around and walked up to the boy. "Here," he offered, ignoring the question and holding out his hand to Keizo, "a memento to remember my lessons." It was more than his grandfather had ever, willingly, given him, he mused. Keizo reached out a tentative hand and picked up the ring the older shinobi was presenting to him. It possessed a dark green gemstone with the character Hoku inscribed on it, and though the blonde new jewelry wasn't really a thing most men wore, he could instinctively feel that this gesture was important. "It is to be worn on your left middle finger," Kakuzu instructed. The boy did as the older shinobi bade, letting out a soft whoa of amazement as the ring, which was rather large for his hand, tightened comfortably around his flesh. Kakuzu dug into his pocket and came out holding a second ring, this one having an orange gemstone with the character San on it. "For your sister, to be worn on her left index finger," he told Keizo, turning around and flicking the ring at the boy from over his shoulder. As the blonde fumbled the catch, Kakuzu gruffly advised, "Tread cautiously, little knight." Unsure what to make of the warning, and the fact that the older shinobi had given him the appropriate nickname, Keizo merely focused on the ring in his hand. "Yeah, she'll really like this. Thanks, Kakuzu Ogi, huh?" Kakuzu was gone, the rings and forest destruction the only things to mark that he'd been there at all. LLL. How'd the mission go? Fine. Naruto arched an eyebrow at his son's distracted response. Everything okay? Keizo fiddled nervously with the ring Kakuzu had given him, trying to sidle towards the door in the process. Yep. Can I? Naruto tutted, holding out his hand. Let's see what you've got there. His son visibly hesitated before taking the ring off and placing it in his father's hand. The older blonde stared at the object for a long moment before quietly asking, "Where'd you get this?" Found it. Keizo, Naruto warned. I can't say. The Kyubi Jinchuriki hummed in thought, tapping his finger against the piece of jewelry. There was a momentary flash of dark green light, and Naruto kicked his desk over to protect his son from the unknown threat, summoning a shield of Jung's threads as he did so for his own safety. Konan had once told him that Akatsuki's rings contained huge stores of chakra that enabled Pain to use his magic lantern body technique, among other tricks. Naruto didn't know them all, but for his son to suddenly come across one, especially the one owned by his former mentor, couldn't be a coincidence. When it became apparent that the ring wasn't going to do anything else, Naruto lowered his shield to find a small scrap of paper on the floor. He picked it up, and after reading the short message, handed the ring back to his son. "Dad? It's yours. Head on home, I'll see you later." Confused, Keizo decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth and left. Naruto straightened his desk once the door was closed and dropped the paper on it, sighing at the message. Bishop to E1, it read. Naruto looked up at the ceiling, a sad smile gracing his lips as a tumult of emotions raced across his mind. Kakuzu, give him hell. You won't be forgotten, I'll make sure of it. Alright guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. Once again, huge thanks to all of my Patreons. I should be posting a couple more stories for you guys over there either today or tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. Anyways, until next time, peace.